Okay, we're on. Welcome back, everybody, to the afternoon session. As some of you may know, what we try and do in the afternoon, I suppose, is think about more located positions, a series of them in our panel discussions. We invite wonderful guests, such as these here today, to talk and give us a kind of opinion-based, perhaps, and located in their own practice. So I'm really delighted to welcome today Dick Pels, who's a sociologist, a freelance writer, and a political commentator. Dick would like to talk, I think, and perhaps relate to some ideas from this morning, from Chantal Mouffe's fantastic lecture, and also relate it a little bit to how he's thinking about the Netherlands and a book that he wrote called The Weakness for the Netherlands. I'm also delighted to invite here Vasif Kortun, who's come to us from Istanbul. Vasif is a writer, curator, and the director and founder of Platform Garanti in Istanbul. He recently published a book which is called Scoring from the Offside, the Scene in Turkey. And he published this with Erdin Kosova. And also I'm delighted to welcome Rosi Braiditti, who's the distinguished professor in the humanities art faculty at Utrecht University, and also a long-term colleague of us who has been very important in helping us with our thinking, and we'll talk about the project Citizens and Subjects, which she has developed with Charles Escher and also with Maria Lavajova from BAC. So I'd like to ask Dick to start. I think each of our speakers will make about a 20-minute presentation, and then, of course, as usual, we open to the floor and welcome your questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. It's an honor to follow on, on Chantal Mouffe's presentation. I must confess, we met about 20 years ago, but I don't know whether she's still here. Oh. Okay. And at a place called the Center for European Studies in Cambridge in the USA. And she asked me, at one point she asked me to dance, to go out dancing with her, and I said no. So maybe our lives could have been different.
Wishful thinking.
But I've always admired her approach, and I thought a speech from this morning, a talk from this morning was very suggestive also. And my intention is to try to link it up a little bit with the content of one of the books I wrote, which is issued in 2005 and called Een zwak voor Nederland in Dutch, or a weak spot for the Netherlands, or weakness for the Netherlands, as you can translate it. It has a cow on the cover, and the cow is in the canal, fallen in the canal. So the suggestion of the front page, the front is a little like we're a bit in trouble in Holland, but as all people, farmers and sons of farmers and daughters of farmers know, the tractor is on its way. The tractor is arriving on the horizon, and we will be able to pull the cow out in the end. So on this optimistic note, let me say that I've learned a lot from Chantal Mouffe's criticism of political essentialism and political rationalism. Actually, she's very close to one of the disputes which is raging in the Netherlands at this very moment, when you talk about the absence of fixed identities or process of identification, because we all know that the Honourable Princess Maxima has just made a speech about this, claiming this very same idea. So you're very close to Princess Maxima's sentiment here, and that of what we call the VRR, or the Scientific Council for Governmental Policy, who has issued a report on national identity, being much more a matter of, or process of identification and non-fixity than anything else. And Maxima's famous line was, there is no Dutch identity, or I have not been able to find the Dutch identity. And this has raised enormous trouble, also from not only from the right, but also from the left of the political spectrum. One of those people who reacted very strongly against Maxima's utterances was Paul Scheffer, who was not here not so long ago. He thought that Maxima was arrogant, that she was living in a gated community, that she was elitist, and that she didn't care about the feelings of a large majority of Dutch people, of the voters of Wilders and Verdonk and those right-wing populists. So he reacted very strongly against it. There has been a very strong we-they confrontational matter in the Netherlands so far. Scheffer is also very much in favor of finding a new we that you talked about. I'm also reminded of the expression of Tariq Ramadan, who's also searching for something like a nouveau nous, and even Nicolas Sarkozy, the French president, has said things in this vein. So the search for a new we, which I associate maybe you also with a kind of communitarian current in political thinking. At least that is where I locate Paul Scheffer. Is something that I would myself be critical of. So I'm much more on the side of both Chantal Mouffe and Princess Maxima on this point. It would be a challenge to speak about the challenge of right-wing populism, but I think I need to skip this because it matters of time. But it's something that you also talked about. What interests me is that right-wing populism poses a multiple challenge to democratic politics and cannot be dismissed out of hand as something that is simply falling outside of the remit of established democracy. First of all, because it does offer some views about how to extend democratic politics as traditionally conceived in the partisan way by means of direct democracy like referenda and direct elections of the mayors, of course, something that we do not have in the Netherlands. And I think it's, by that very reason, it poses a challenge. There are other things totally wrong with it, but it is a challenge. It is a challenge to have a movement which is on the borders of the democratic circle, but more generally inside of it, I would say. Wilders is a Democrat, Verdonk is and remains a Democrat, but they do embrace notions about popular nationalism or one people, thinking about one people, the unity of the people, that you would associate very much with non-democratic or anti-democratic movements. But it is an interesting combination, which follows from the heritage of Pim Fortuyn in 2002, the electoral revolution that we had. And Pim Fortuyn was the first one to combine that new nationalism, that's actually very strange and foreign to Dutch culture and history, with a notion that democracy is up for grabs, or that it could be extended in with means of more direct democratic means. Another challenge would be political style, and that's an important notion, I guess, because the aesthetics of politics is very important in those movements, and Pim Fortuyn was one who embodied that new political style that combined in content and form in a fluent way. And I think no political party or no politician in the Netherlands can be any longer outside of this challenge. So you see everywhere across the whole political spectrum in the Netherlands, people adopting a new political style, which is partly derived from the challenge of right-wing populist politicians. Let me say a few words about this weak spot that I have for my own country. Because this is, I think, a rather precise, for me, it's a rather precise way of talking about national identity and of my own nationality, which I rediscovered when I was teaching in England for a couple of years, not before. The book contains a similar defense of agonistic democracy, which you can find in Chantal Mouffe's work, which I try to extend in the direction of what I call a relativistic democracy, which is also a plea for a positive identity weakness, including the notion of an active relativism as a core value of Dutch identity. A new idea of the Netherlands, which I suppose we need, or are looking for, should not be sought in a strengthened identity. The challenge of the neoconservative and Fortuynist movements is that we need to strengthen our identity in order to be able to fight off these strong identities, especially that of Islam, that is threatening us, threatening to overrule us. but rather in a weak identity. Holland is a vague and dynamic entity which is continually restructured and contested, not a finished and rounded thing, an accomplished fact or a constraining essence which exists outside of us or can be found ready-made in historical reality. The Netherlands is reinvented every day. And we should not attempt to artificially repair this ontological weakness of the Netherlands. There's not such a thing as a popular soul that we can find and can adapt ourselves to, which defines our national identity. To make a pun on the popular Tros TV program, which you wouldn't probably know, let's not search for an essentialist heart of the Netherlands. A weakness for the Netherlands is more than enough, words and all. We can do without a powerful, militant, and proud national identity which is currently advocated by the New Right coalition of fortuinists, neoliberals, and neoconservatives. See, for example, Rita Verdonk's No Movement, Pride of Holland, or Pride of the Netherlands. It almost sounds like a ship's name, Pride of the Netherlands. The strength of the Dutch national character is precisely located in a certain character weakness, which is informed by modesty with regard to our national values and accomplishments, and hence offers space for permanent discord, permanent differences of opinion about what these values and accomplishments are. So it's not a superior certainty about a hard normative core, our famous or infamous normen en waarden, which we should all share according to the present government, but an uncertain idea of the Netherlands that offers, in my view, the best point of departure both for the integration of so-called strange cultures in our society, if it is ours, as for the integration of our own culture in the broader one of Europe and the world. How's time?
5 more minutes.
Okay. Let me then try to extend this a little in the direction of the core of what Chantal Mouffe has been offering us, to the crucial role of public democratic debate or polemic, polemos, as socially cohesive forces and also as cohesive forces in politics. So my claim is that it's not so much that our cohesion, our identity, is not so much found in a shared obligatory set of norms and values, but in the very discussion the discord that we are conducting with each other. And this is often underestimated, I think, that the notion in which conflict and dissensus can bind people together, that conflict can be a scene of community, but not in community in a sense that it's all inclusive and makes us all into the same, but precisely because of it plays out differences and cherishes differences also, and productive differences. And this form of democratic debate, I think, is the core of what we need to defend in our democratic culture. So it leads. It's another way of saying that I cherish the notion of weakness of our national character and our national identity. It applies it to the democratic system that we are having. And here I think the Chantal Mouffe's suggestion about the closure that is needed when we are thinking about the we-they opposition, and when she said it's not so much a matter of abolishing the we-they opposition, which would lead us into a wrong kind of communitarianism, but precisely how to define it, how to establish the we-they connection. And in my own terms, this could be done not by drawing strong boundaries, but by drawing weak boundaries, which is a way of drawing a boundary, isn't it? So it is a way of defining not strong enemies, but weak enemies, or what she calls adversaries. But there is a demarcation that is needed, I think, and the demarcation is found in is actually very simple. The criterion by which we can define our culture, the core, the heart of our culture, the heart of our weakness, so to speak, or our positive weakness, is precisely the need to defend those institutions and practices that enable us to talk to each other without too much violence, also too much symbolic or verbal violence, in order to conduct that conversation about who we are. So we don't know who we are, but we don't need to know who we are very much, as long as we know that we need to defend the institutions and practices of democratic culture, which come down basically to the notion of democratic conversation, how to conduct it, and what is needed to enter into democratic conversations. Which needs, of course, what we need, of course, is the constitutional state and other institutions. We need a system of education, which hopefully gives equality of opportunity to everyone. But what we also need is a capacity or a preparedness to enter into a kind of self-relativization, or a kind of taking distance of our own, from our own views. And I think that this is a very important element, a dispositional element, not so much an institutional element of our identity, but a dispositional one. And I happen to think that this is also one of the most important values that we can learn from the Enlightenment. Now, in the entire discussion about neoconservatism and Pim Fortuyn, etc., we are bombarded with those sets of values or core values, which is so-called non-negotiable values, which we should all subscribe to, which are the separation between church and state, equality between men and women, between homosexuals and heterosexuals, etc. And I find it curious that one value is always left out of this enumeration, which is the capacity for relativism, or not the bad kind of relativism, but the capacity to actively engage in a relativization of our own culture and views, because that's maybe the single most important precondition for all of us to be able to enter into a productive conversation, a democratic conversation about who we are. So I think this is not only a positive view of our weakness, our ability to engage in an active relativism, an offensive relativism, even a relativism that it may sound very paradoxical and curious, but a relativism that is out to conquer people who conquer the non-relativists, or give them something to think about, something very that can be very strongly defended, something that you can even be proud of. I can be proud of a certain relativistic attitude or set of values that enable me to think about what the other person that enters into conversation with myself would think, which gives me a certain leverage over the conversation, which is actually better, which is more productive than when you are stuck in your own identity, a hard identity, and only confront the other hard identity, and that's it. So not only do I think it's a positive filling in of our democratic identity, and of course this is not particularly Dutch, but it's at least it's European, and maybe even broader than that. At least it's an advocatory attitude that I would like to think of as European, as an element of European culture, as opposed maybe to other cultures. So it gives us an identity, and it is an identity. It's not nothing. It is a very important thing. And it does demarcate, to come back to Chantal Mouffe's earlier point, it does draw a boundary with those attitudes or dispositions or views that fall outside of it. It, so to speak, posits its own criterion. It's a reflexive operation. To say that you engage in active relativism is also to exclude, or at least to frown upon those views that want to exclude any sort of self-relativization. and then exclude themselves, of course, positions that exclude themselves logically from that conversation that we are having. That it is a view of the good life, I think. It is a positive view of the good life, but it is a view, let me end with this note, it is a view of the good life in which the good life can be defined as a way of life in which we all are engaged in freely talking about what it means, what the good life actually means. So the good life is not something that you deposit at the front of our conversation, but I would say the good life is that conversation in which we talk freely, without violence, about what it means to say something like this. So the content and the meaning of the good life, which is always in dispute. Thanks.
Thank you, Dick. Thank you. I'd like to take up from that very interesting thinking about the spaces for public debate and conflict to think about Vasif and how you indeed set up an institution, a public institution, and maybe you could talk a little bit about whether you think it serves some of those purposes.
Well, okay, you got me there because I wasn't actually thinking of talking about platform a little bit, perhaps, but maybe I'll do it. I'll do this towards the end.
Maybe later, yeah.
Talk just to basically kind of give a frame of a general frame of the last 20 years or so, what has been happening. Because also, when Charles asked me to speak about a bit about some Turkish shows or exhibitions from Turkey in Europe, how they were received, how they were structured, how things were tamed, streamlined, enhanced, or controlled. And I mean, that was one issue. And the other one was also the issue of curating into a vacuum, as guys would say, versus curating into a contested territory that happens, that has been recently happening in Turkey in the basically last 2-3 years or so. And the other thing was how is the reception of Turkish art in Western Europe looked at from platforms' point of view. So these were basically the three things. I think I'm just going to kind of chronologically divide these 20 years into three sections. One is 1987 to 1993. 87 because it was the first biennial took place in 87, and 93 is kind of a cutoff date from not because it's a particular date, but just because it precedes the new generation of artists coming out around 94 and 95, which changed the whole context. So 87 to 93, then 93 to 2000 is the first decade of national exhibitions taking place in places in Europe. And 2000-2007 is, well, it's the biennial decade for one, internationally, so you have to look at it from that perspective as well. And for us, it's the formation of platform. Not that we leave such a strong mark in history, but it's, since I cannot speak outside from where I am, I'll just go ahead and do it anyhow. So, I mean, one is that this process is not directly relational to the depth or the complexity of the artist situation in Turkey as it transformed in the last 20 years. It's not. That is to say, the demand is an outcome of different processes. It doesn't have much to do with the art world per se. One is the situation of Turkey's diaspora, because all the original projects had to do with the tooling of, let's say, of the contemporary art situation, from retooling of the contemporary art situation from Turkey, and how it would play a particular role with the integration of the diaspora to where they were living. And when I mean diaspora, it's very clear that the only exhibitions of Turkey abroad have basically taken place in Germany, Netherlands, and Austria. And so with 2 million Turks and Kurds in Germany, that's a sizable population right there. And in terms of proportion, it's with over 360,000, let's say, Dutch Turks and Kurds. So that makes it the second place in the list. In the list. I mean, obviously, I mean, everything became very clear to the artists who were going abroad to Germany and Netherlands and doing exhibitions. There is that, you know, you have nothing to do with the diaspora. You have nothing to do with the diaspora Turks and Kurds. I mean, they come from a complete different reality. The formation, the cultural formations are completely different, and we hardly even actually share language. Even the language differs, and it's radically different actually. So that was always a failed attempt, no matter what. Then the second thing is the process of the European integration, and so a lot of funds were unleashed, especially after 2002, after December 2002, after the talks opened officially. So there were a lot of projects suddenly coming into fruition, into demand, and because wherever there is money, then there's a curator who wants to do an exhibition about Turkish situation. You know. So first comes the B League, and then comes the A League. This is a standard, and we kind of appreciate it, I guess. And then there's the post-Balkan War situation, which is kind of the post-traumatic. Let's say the post-traumatic situation that gave rise to a whole range of inter-Balkan exhibition or Balkan exhibitions in different parts of Europe, in Germany, in particular in Austria, in which artists from Turkey were heavily, let's say, included, or they were the majority, actually. And then the post 9/11 situation, which then again put the focus on the country as a kind of a bridge between places. That's how people think of it from outside. And of course, the fourth factor are the Mediterranean. Is the big game being played out in the Mediterranean region between Spain, Italy, and France. So that also includes inevitably Turkey in the game. Basically, I mean, the struggle is mostly between Spain and France, actually. So there's all of that. Now, okay, let me briefly say, like, the context is like this. In 1980, there is the coup d'etat, our last dictatorship, our last official coup d'etat and official dictatorship, when they last rolled out the tanks and, you know, occupied the TV station and the radio station and things like this. And after this period and up until 1985 or so, the trauma was very severe. And part of this trauma is that actually the elite, let's say the elite, the intellectual elite, the artists, and the new generation of artists broke their contract with the government, with the state, in extension with the public sector. Of course, this contract was already broken, and it was by the government long time ago. Not that they were getting support from the artists or the cultural field was not getting support from the government or from the state anyhow, since for a long time. But 80 was a critical break in the way that. Two things were broken, which we can actually discuss later. One is like the publicness, the potential publicness of contemporary art was already was hijacked, was out of the picture. Secondly, you would no longer ask anything from the government or the state. That's the cessation of the contract, which means that 1980, just before the coup d'etat, there were the new economic policy that was ratified. That's still the same, basically the template that the country is going with, which was the neoliberal economy, a neoliberal policy. So the moment the break happened was also at the moment when neoliberalism was officially and top-down initiated. So you ran away from one thing, you fell into the lap of another. Not what we realized that much later, of course. The break also implies something else, which is that the classical modernization, let's say, of Turkey was built on a kind of westernization, which was actually to fight westernization, you know. So there was a national, situated, locatable, contextual middle class that began to evaporate after the neoliberalization. And that class, with all of its extensions, oops, I lost my computer. Okay, with all of its extensions in the field of culture, was also put in a complicated context, and we are still going through the friction of this change in the economy, which reflects clearly on the situation of the art. It's so that during this time, which is the last 27 years, a new generation of artists came through. They were, let's say, secularized, independent, without any links and associations with the government, not teaching at the universities or the public universities, not associated with any kind of governmental or whatever institution, and actually they became by default a new subjects. They were not embedded in the state ideology as the artists before, because the state ideology was because they let's say the citizens were so embedded with the state ideology that state did not even actually have to have any ideology, because all about the whole artistic field was all about progress, leading the nation, leading the people, etc., etc. There were a different kind of baggage that the artists were carrying, as opposed to the new generation that had completely shed all of that baggage. And of course, they were privileged by the neoliberal situation. Now, it's just want to tell you a little personal experience. In I think it was 1990. This is the first time I kind of packed my bags, and with a whole bunch of artist files with me from Turkey. I went very kind of innocently and in a quite amateur and stupid way to Europe, and went to several institutions. One was, I remember, the Institute für Auslandbeziehungen in Germany. It's a place based in Stuttgart. His mission is the mission of which is actually to receive exhibitions from abroad, also to export exhibitions to other countries. And I was not even let through the door. I couldn't even get an appointment, and so. That was a very good experience, because on the way back, it was very fast theorizing, actually. On the way back from that trip, I realized that I had to make things home. I had to fix the home situation. I had to create a different context in Istanbul, that this kind of shopping would, that shopping was not successful. I knew that instinctively at the time. I had not quite figured it out or theorized it yet. The institution I wanted to start was taught basically in 1990, but we really started in 2001. So there's a kind of an 11-year learning in the middle. So 87 to 93, I'm just going to list a few exhibitions. It's good to remember. One is, before 87, there were no exhibitions of artists from Turkey abroad. You had, of course, in Germany, kind of little ghettoized spaces where the diasporan artists would show, or in Sweden where diasporan socialist artists would show, and things like this. But it never went beyond that, and they were always contained within this ghettoized institutions. Not that ghettoization is actually. Ghettoization is a different process, actually. I mean, I remember in 1998, there was an exhibition of artists from Turkey, quite a developed one, called Iskorpit, that took place at the Haus der Kultur and der Welt. One of the curators was René Bloch. And at the same time, there was this exhibition called Sensation in Berlin as well. So Sensation was a national exhibition, and Iskorpit was a national exhibition, or a nation-based exhibition too. But the way the two were received were obviously completely different. So it's not only a matter of space, but it's a matter of framing. Of course, I mean, Haus der Kultur and der Welt does not really help as an exhibition venue, but still, at least it was large in size. Now, so starting in '93, was first an exhibition Skidam here in Holland. Then '94 there was an exhibition called Iskele, which means, let's say, port or a docking station. That was at IFA, Institute for Aslanbezingen, both places. And another project in Budapest, Crossing Geographies. Then Dialogues, and then Iskorpit, which is a fish from the Bosphorus. And then there from 1988 on the Balkan exhibitions. And there was another project in '99 and in Copenhagen, again in Holland, called Out of Nowhere. 2000, 2007 is a bit different. That's the biennial decade, let's say. It started with early spring in Copenhagen. And then 2002 in Rotterdam, between the waterfronts. Yeah. 2004, Japan, it's called Where, here. 2005, along the city gates. 2005, again at ZKM, Call Me Istanbul. And then another exhibition in Berlin, the name of which I forgot, but it was again another Istanbul show, but the website had a big, huge Turkish flag, not huge, but Turkish flag on it. This is also the period where the Balkan exhibitions are taking place, and from the country exhibition, we've just already switched to city projects. Now, early on, at the end of the 90s, the position of the artist was kind of complicated. You're not speaking of diasporan artists. You're speaking of artists who are actually located and living in and trying to do something in Istanbul. That's one. Two, the country does not have a history of colonization, so there's no payback involved, or there's no goodwill or involved with the European approach, let's say. So it's a different context, and the artist is as home, which is not quite a home, because there's no support or venues, or there's nothing at home that you can actually do, in a way. And then there's the temporary support from abroad, where you could actually realize your more complicated projects, but they would never see home. And then there's the biennial period in Istanbul, where, let's say, the censorship is temporarily suspended. Our critical work can be presented, and then closure comes after the biennial. And so that was a difficult time. So during this time, we started this institution called Platform, which is basically a three-tier institution. There is residency, an archive, a library, and an exhibition program. But we put our major effort into the archive and the library. It had transformed from a kind of let's say, an artist initiative called ICAP, Istanbul Contemporary Art Project, that we had started, and we moved all our materials there. So it was it was a kind of a strategic take on everything. And I was also I'd always been thinking about Jean-Hubert Martin's Magicien. He was not the only curator, but Magicien de la Terre exhibition, and part of the interesting kind of the, let's say, catchy thing in that project was that the curatorial team did not trust the locals in places where they went to. So they bypassed the local context for reasons that maybe I not explain, but because the reasons were kind of clear that the locals were embedded in a political or state context and they could not be supported, you know, or according to Jean Hubert or Magicien's view that the locals were late modernist elites that that Jean Hubert's team did not want to look at. So to find the truth and the authentic and the real, they just kind of jumped through. So if the locals were not to be trusted, we could at least do something else. We said, like, this is the archive. So the archive was developed in a way, in a quite a complex way, that anybody who would come to Istanbul had to come to us. You know, it was this clear. You know, so from Venice to Documenta to whichever exhibition anybody was doing, they had to stop. They had to make a stop at Platform, and that disproportionately made us disproportionately important in the international context, not at all in the local context, of course. I mean, for artists it was important, but not for anybody else. And we kind of established this policy that we would not give names to the visitors. That wasn't the idea. You know, we're not putting a list on them, a list in front of them like everybody else was doing. Because if you went and did the same thing to the foundation, where the Biennale, the institution behind the Biennale in Istanbul, they would always give you 12 artists whom you would visit, and then you would go home. Ours was a public institution in that way. That they just had to come and do the work. And but early on, this was quite efficient. And there was still a generation of artists who had I think it's not only a local situation, but they were quite coherent and adamant about keeping their position. You know, if somebody came from abroad, they said, why do you want to do a show with me? Why do you think I want to show with Turkish and Kurdish artists? Why do you think I want to show with women artists? So why do you think, people did not say yes. And a lot of projects were actually refused by the good artists. And they said, like, I don't want to show with Turks. This is not my context. You know, this doesn't say anything. This doesn't bring any value or any particular enhancement to the work. It doesn't make the work read better. And this is not where I am. And I am who I am, and I'm not the nation. I'm not the we. It worked for a while, but then later on, as the funds were getting more, as the funds were getting better, the opportunities were getting diversified. In a way, I call this bribery. And also, the new generation did not come through this. And then there was the yes generation of artists. The yes generation. I mean, first you accept, you take part, then you mourn about it. And this is what's been happening for a while. It's except for one project. I think after a few pretty horrific projects like the ZKM exhibition, and where they were tooled literally. I mean, this is a very problematic process. Maybe 20 artists or so pulled back from an exhibition just before 3 months. Before 3 months of opening, because again, I mean, it's either an amateur thing. The details are not important, but there's not a reciprocity in treatment of the artist. And also, I mean, we are really professionals. We like things clear. And when people come from Germany or something, they want to kind of exercise, as Hussein is here, he knows, they want to exercise their Oriental side through us. They come late to meetings, and they say, they don't, where we're like very, analytical. It's just exactly the same opposite. Whereas, like, we want to be German, we want clear. And so there's a whole confusion about this kind of reciprocities these days. I mean, reciprocity of, between the artist's projection of what the guest desires, and the guest's projection of what the artist should be desiring. And the friction between these desires sometimes produces quite interesting projects. But I think it's over now. I mean, it's even the city exhibitions are over. And I mean, do you want me to speak about platform in detail, or
No,
this is just not necessary, right?
No.
Yeah, this is good. And do I have time, or?
You have another 5 minutes.
Okay, then I'll speak about platform. No, I mean it's. I mean, this is more interesting, I think, for not for the Dutch situation, but for our context, is that when we started in 2001, it was probably the only institution in the country, in the whole region, that was structured in a way with professional management and professional mission. It was not since all the other institutions in the city and in the country are still private institutions, and we were one of the private institutions to start with. The private institutions before us had two defaults. One was that they were structured through the mother institutions, that would be a bank or whatever. So they had a particular management style, and the other time they were all formed during the war. During the war in the southeast. So the war in the southeast created a context where, since all your funding is private, and private is lending money to the public, and they have, to the government, and there's a lot of give and take between the two. There's no way you can do anything that is actually raising any hairs. I mean, you have to be extremely proper with what you do, and of course the banks or whatever did not want to sacrifice this position, and over the years this created a very different kind of cultural context, kind of mediocre, soft, and a kind of a ghost cultural field. And it's also created its own subjects and its own audiences, and et cetera, et cetera. And that situation is, to a large extent, to a particular extent, is still going on. After us, things. I mean, after 2001, after we started the institution, after we showed pretty much that this kind of example could work, other institutions followed suit. And now it's become as you may know, it's become a kind of an extreme public situation. I mean, extreme situation in Istanbul, where almost every day there's another museum. In the last 3 years, we had 4 museums opening up. Now two more are coming back. But the critical thing even if the expansion is taking place, is that none are public institutions, and so in the minds of the spectator, of the audience, or the public, since culture and art is still not something public, because it's not in their psyche, it's not their tax money, it's not their investment, it's an extra. I mean, it ties beautifully actually with the way the world is going, which is the complete merger and engagement of the contemporary art field with the entertainment industry. So this kind of extra and luxury situation that's built in Istanbul fits perfectly with the global situation, that things are actually flawless in this way. But that's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Vasif. Thank you very much. Now we'll move on to our final presentation, Rosi Braiditti.
Everybody is tired now and just want to run out and have your legal drugs, so I'll keep it very short and to the point. It's a great pleasure to be here, and it feels like I should take an apartment in this museum. I'm here every day. We've been involved for as long as I can remember. The Utrecht University, the vanabbe, and the BAC, the Basis for Actuele Kunst Center for the Arts in Utrecht, in this, let's face it, retrospectively megalomaniac project that combines the making of the Dutch pavilion at the Biennale with the making of a critical reader that replaced the glossy catalogue. And we still have some copies. I've got one from my good friend and colleague, Chantal, with enormous thanks and gratitude for your work. But even just editing that critical reader that Charles, Maria Lavayova, and I took care of was bad enough. And then as if that wasn't enough work, we decided to bring the Biennale back home with a series of lectures that have been running from September until yesterday, actually, 2 days ago, at Utrecht University, held concurrently with the Becoming Dutch project here in Eindhoven and with the caucus. So if you're looking at this as a rhizomic nomadic web of public interventions, I think we've been really stretching ourselves to try to make another set of voices heard in this rather moribund, I think, and at times depressing Dutch debate where some very bright lights like Dick Pels and a few other buddies exist, but globally it's at times despairing as a general landscape. So it's, I think what is interesting about the citizens and subjects is that the three people that really led this coalition are foreigners. I think that Charles, Maria, and myself are people with different degrees of weakness for the Netherlands. I'm supposed I'm the one who is the most in love with this complicated and sort of contradictory place. I'm also very married to a Dutch individual. The other two helps. The other two, I think, I don't want to speak for Charles, but different degrees and different kinds of ambivalence are involved. But when Dick was talking about the Pride in and of Holland, I not only thought of the ship, but I immediately saw a pub with this name, Pride of Holland. And I think we should, when our interventions in the public debate fail, we can just go and run a good pub, and that will be a way of intervening. All of this to say that my remarks are made in this context of an attempt by resident foreigners to think about our own engagement with a culture at a time of tremendous turmoil, and with a profound act of faith, really, in the immense resources that this culture has, independently at times of its political class. Political classes at the moment, right across the board, are not our favorite people. Maybe we should have gone into politics and stopped complaining instead of staying into the universities. I come from a country, Italy, that cannot exactly claim to have a fantastic political class, so God bless the Netherlands, is all I can say. The caucus has been a major interest and concern of mine. I checked the work that you've been doing and looked at the workshop outlines, and I'm most impressed. If anybody needs a dose of hope, I think looking at the work done in those workshops alone should put you in a divine mood. There's a lot going on. There's hope out there. We just have continuing the kicking ass exercises and the fight against doom, gloom, and stupidity. Just to mention two things. I also very much enjoy this glossary. I'm into glossaries big time. I think I'll only write recipe books and glossaries in this second phase of my career. This is a fantastic booklet, and even the word faith that I just pronounced consciously is drawn from this glossary. And there are three other entries that I really are relevant for the few remarks that I will make on citizenship. And it's the entry ethnicity on page 13 that pronounces the word that launched 1,000 complaints when Princess Maxima pronounced that word, and the word is identification. If 75% of the Dutch had a fit at the mention that identity should be reduced with identification, they should have read the Becoming Dutch glossary. It was already in there. So what's the fuss all about? Migration on page 21 and nationality on page 29 are also very, very relevant for anybody, I think, who wants to come to terms with what I would call the practices of flexible citizenship, such as I see them operating already in the world that we inhabit. And the lecture, of course, is much longer, so I can only give you a set of quick parameters for defending the basic thesis that if 75% of the Dutch population is very, very sort of threatened and feeling very fearful of the fact that ethnicity, nationality, and citizenships are delinked and are getting reaggregated in different ways, well, they are bloody right to be like that, because this is exactly the situation that we're in. And if they are nostalgic for a beautiful old period when ethnicity, nationality, and citizenship fitted in together beautifully in one hard-boiled egg, unity of firm and steady identities, I've got news for you. That time is over, never to return. So now let's get on with the business of dealing with this disgregation of place of origin, nationality, and citizenship, and see how we can reaggregate them in different ways and modalities. And I think if you look at the actual report, when Her Royal Highness made that remark, I think it was a fantastic postmodern moment. What a fantastic outburst of postmodern political theory. I mean, it's enough to make Rorty raise and say, haha, I told you so. But of course, I'm somebody who's been arguing, like Dick, like many of our friends, for years for fluid, mobile, nomadic identities, and I know for a fact that actually it does not work. People get cognitively, morally, psychically threatened, and there are reasons why steady, hard-booted, populist, hard-boiled egg identities are back. People need that reassurance. So the issue of fear, of cognitive, moral, psychic dispossession is absolutely part of this conversation, and this is why I started referring to the project of Citizens and Subjects of the Dutch Pavilion at the Biennale, because it was addressing the issue of fear. Fear of dispossessions, fear that they are taking away the shreds of this pathetic little identity, which is all we have. Me, myself, and I. If I don't even have that, what's left? I would say go shopping, but of course that is a neoliberal indictment. When everything else fails, there's always the sales. I should go into PR.
You really should.
Well, you can see where this is going. So I, being a scholar of the old school, immediately got hold of the national report, and I'm sure people like Dick and Bauke sitting in the audience advised the government on, because that report that launched 1,000 complaints is a fantastic piece of very well-researched analysis of how this country is going, and also it defines identification very, very carefully. And I will very quickly mention the 3 kinds of identification that the report for the Wetenschappelijke Raad voor Regeringsbeleid focuses on. The first is functional identification. If you're a foreigner country, you need to be able to participate in the basic functional runnings of society, from getting an education to catching a bus to having an aspirin. I mean, just surviving in the basic, making a decent cup of coffee. Maria Lavajova, who came to this country recently and had to follow the inburgering courses, the citizenship course. When I came over almost 20 years ago, they weren't around, so I wasn't made into a citizen. I became some sort of one. But Maria, who came 7 years ago, had to undergo the citizenship course. This is the woman who 8 years later represents the country in the Dutch Pavilion at the Biennale, the first woman and the first foreigner and the first person under 40 to do so, by the way. She was taught how to make a cup of coffee, because that's a part of the functionality of Dutch life. As an Italian who never touches Dutch coffee, I would need a course as well on how to not make a cup of coffee in the Dutch. So functional identification. Then normative identification respects the laws and rules and regulations, get on with the fact that this is a country with a legal code, respect it or go home. It's basic, straightforward. Tariq Ramadan put it very beautifully. It's the most important element of mixed citizenship, the normative identification, which includes, of course, those norms and rules regarding the management of private life, sexuality, the management of the private sphere, which can prove conflictual and controversial. So the private-public divide here is an issue, but normative identification is a basic respect for the laws of the host country. And then emotional identification. I think that Dick gave us a beautiful representation of that, getting emotional attached in different degrees to that landscape, to the place, to the colors, to the smell, to the opaque beauty of this landscape, and some sort of attachment. So I think it's a very sane, a very down-to-earth, extremely useful decomposition of identity into levels of identification that I think should reassure everybody. And of course, it didn't. It made everybody completely nervous. There's a 75% of the Dutch population going into a fit without having the reflex of going to read the report in the first place. And I want to start from this, from what I would call the absence of curiosity, the absence of epistemic responsibility, the collapse into ignorance. We don't even bother to check this. We take it for what it is and we go for the kill. And I'm very surprised that even somebody like Paul Schaefer would go for this public cultivation and rewarding of ignorance. And I'm not interested to find out what this is. This smacks of something that would offend my identity. I go for the kill. From here, if I had the time, which I promise you I don't because it's late in the day, I would develop a whole argument on the absolute importance of developing an epistemic sense of responsibility for the categories of thought that we throw around into the public debate, and to force, almost make a moral obligation, if not at critical intelligence, at least at getting our basic terminology and definitions right. It's a Spinozist approach to political action. Let's start by understanding the conditions of the debate, the basic kind of terms of definition of what we are actually talking about. Let's start with a minimum amount of sort of calm and self-reflective exercise in defining the terms of our engagement with this discussion. Of course, it's putting maybe the threshold a little bit high, but I have enough respect for my countrymen and women to think that we must be able to have a discussion on identity as identification without starting to throw things at each other and looking for the usual scapegoating. A minimum amount of Spinoza's understanding of the conditions of our bondage, the condition of our limitations, surely has to be possible. And the case that I would have made then to contribute to this is to show three different ways in which, under the effect of globalization, migration, and European framework, European legislation, three axes according to which place of origin or ethnicity, nationality, and citizenship simply fall apart. They're simply disaggregated. And you can do it by looking at what the effects of neoliberal globalization upon the world, the extent to which a flow of cash, a flow of commodities, a flow of labor is absolutely part of how capital functions. And in that flow of labor, there is a whole class of people, curators are one, professors are others, very crash-hot public intellectuals are other, as are millions of faceless, not so hot individuals that simply move across the globe following not so much a career which doesn't exist anymore, but a cash flow of sort. And here the case of footballers, and let's not name the god, the one and only David Beckham, but many hot kind of sports athletes cross the globe, multiply their passports, and have no problems getting green cards or visas because they represent a massive capital investment, and they can cross any possible boundaries, and in the same ways as goods and commodities do. So there is a sense in which sort of nationality and citizenship are negotiable along the axis of massive capital flow, which is at the moment a great reality. Also in academia, you may know that not only has tenure been suspended in academia, but so have fixed salaries. Most universities these days headhunt. We don't search, we headhunt, and we offer hot money for hot names. And this is the way in which university will survive the global educational market, the competition. You may know that there is a list of top universities made by the University of Shanghai or somewhere in China, 50 universities in the top 50 in the world, 35 are American, 5 are the UK, 4 at the bottom are European, and the rest is the other. And every European university is trying to get on the top 50 because this means that you get a chunk of the educational market. It's run exactly the same way as any corporation would be run. I think we compete really with Unilever and Philips. I don't know how the art world is, but this is what academia has become. So a disgregation of the classical unity, ethnicity, nationality, citizenship as an effect of globalization. Second, and if you look at globalization theory, the latest book by Naomi Klein, it's all there, the extent to which this sort of boundaries shift and get recomposed. Second area, of course, migration, much less glamorous, but world migration, and again, flow of labor, but not glossy, not glamorous, and not pretty, usually anonymous, disposable bodies, accelerating through the different pockets of production units and special international assembly zones, which now dot and spot the globe. Eastern Europe is full of those entire precincts of nations where the big corporations of the world are assembling their products. The migratory flows are absolutely part of this disgregation of place of origin, nationality, and citizenship, but they form the underbelly of a much more glamorous picture. And migration studies at the moment are a big growth area in academia, is trying to map the different ways in which, paradoxically and contradictory, flows of people and boundary crossings produce an enormous digital kind of underclass, and the new underclass of globalization, which creates a number of political and ethical issues. But that's another form of disgregation of the three classical structures of subjectivity. The third axis of disgregation is the European impact, European citizenship. And of course, every time I talk about Europe in the Netherlands as in other countries, I feel like I'm beating a dead horse. It took no less than Her Majesty the Queen to reopen the debate on Europe in this country after it was rather brutally shut down on the Turkish issue in the referendum. There was the Polish plumber and the Turkish kind of invader in France and the Netherlands that shut down the discussion on the European dimension, a discussion that I plead that we reopen as fast as we can, because we need to look again at what is made possible by the European framework of legal citizenship. And to cut a very long story short, I've written many things on this that you can go and check on my website. The legal framework for the European Union is the official disconnection of nationality from citizenship. It's the official, the legal format is a becoming European of anybody that is either born in a nation state that gives them the birthright to have access to the European legislation, or enters that nation state through a variety of angles. The actual jurisprudence model of European legislation is a becoming European of everybody, no matter where you are born. And the radical reading of this, a radical reading that has the names of people like Ulrich Preuss at the Free University in Berlin, people like Yves Meny working at the European Institute, the radical reading or the progressive reading of this is if everybody has to become European, if there is a formal disjunction between nationality and citizenship, if European citizenship is another level, so to speak, next level up, like in video game, then we could have grant access to European citizenship to a number of foreigners. It's called flexible citizenship, temporary, interim citizenship. A number of the people that inhabit, work in our midst could access that nationality just as easily. Legally, there are no problems. Politically, the mountains of resistance go up immediately. So the discussion of flexible citizenship, a term adopted for Aya Ong and people who work on labor sociology in California, is a sort of an opening up of possibilities of access to citizenship right that would formalize the disconnection between citizenship and place of birth or nationality, and making participation, taxation with not taxation without representation, the key element in a new format of citizenship. I think this is the progressive potential of the EU. It is a discussion worth having, and not let the political class collapse this discussion into, fortress Europe, only Europeans become European. It is absolutely not so. The modalities there are far more progressive at the European level than they are at the nation state level. So the third dimension of European citizenship revisited would be another way of officializing this flexible model that would put the nails in the coffin of any unity between I was born here, I am from here, this is my place, I am a European. There would be a process of becoming European, which I also read a little bit with the Deleuze and Guattari in Becoming Minoritarian. Tony Negri has written about this on the becoming European as a becoming minoritarian, a critique of Fortress Europe, a critique of the center. It's a political project, and it is everything, of course, that is not happening at the moment. If I have time and I don't, the conclusion of this would be three ethical models. if we're looking at what the ethical implications, the politics of this are clear, I think, but the ethical implications of the neoliberal model of disjunctions is a sort of banalized biopolitical management of our lives. I mean, the neoliberal sort of free circulation of people means a disgregation of the notion of citizenship, so that we are, to quote Nick Rose of the LSE, bio-citizens and responsible for the well-being and health and wealth of our organism. We are fundamentally personally responsible for to the extent to which we function, we fit into the present system. In other words, the neoliberal model of flexible citizenship is a privatization, hyper-individualistic privatization of the self. We have to take care of our health, and think of the problem of health insurance if you're a foreigner. Think of the fact that even in this country we're thinking of taxing health care for people who are not legal, whereas the definition of citizenship means that you're healthy and clean and you don't carry diseases. Think of the screening of people for diseases in migration, the extent to which a biogenetic model of health is part of this neoliberal model of citizenship. So there, the ethics really is hyper-individualism and a sort of take care of your genes and of your health because nobody else will. In the migration model, we go immediately into the bare life of Agamben. Here is the politics of survival. It's citizenship as getting the bare minimum and the right of the people who live in our midst to have survival. I mean, whether that means a roof over their head, enough to eat, or the famous, infamous healthcare, we are really at the bare life level. Camps, detention centers, and again, I want to refer you to the Biennale project of Citizens and Subject, where we turn the Ritford Pavilion into a detention center to make the point, this is how our social space is organized. This is how we are actually allowing our states, our governments, our nation states to be detention centers. And so they are bare minimum politics of survival and ethics that we can play with Foucault, we can play with anything so long as we acknowledge its urgency. And at the level of the European, of course, reopening the political debate on the one hand, and an ethics of decentering, critiquing, diffusing Fortress Europe and becoming European is a serious progress and project of self-reflexivity and moving forward in what Habermas has called the post-nationalist frame of mind, and a post-nationalist Europe as a new ethical space. I could quote Balibar, and I could quote many people on this. As far as I'm concerned, that's the road to travel. But I'm also very aware that if even Princess Maxima cannot get a little message across about the flexibility, there's very little that we can do except not to give up the struggle. They can delay us, they will never delete us.
Thank you, Rosi. Thank you very much to all the participants. That was really fascinating and really important presentations that we've had today. I think I might ask one or two questions, and then given the time, I really want to open it out to the floor as quickly as possible. So I hope you're all thinking of questions too. Vasif, I would love to ask you, I found it really fascinating and important to think about how Europe indeed has engaged in kind of processes of identity formation around notions of Turkish art and all the kind of wrong-headedness of it and the developments of it and the phases of it. And I'm wondering about the book that you just wrote and the notion of representing or talking about the Turkish scene. So I'm just wondering what kind of framing devices you used or problematics there was or need to talk about or enunciate a Turkish scene.
I mean, the book was not chronologically organized, but it was a survey of the last 20 years, and it was organized around several issues. One was space, public space, gender, politics, migration, and new positions. So it was a clustering of particular positions into to each other to make it more meaningful. It's called scoring from the offside, or offside but a goal, which was kind of an awry look into the situation where the official story is another story, but also it was a situation that was invisible. I mean, it was a situation that was locally invisible. So that was part of the offside as well. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Dick, I would like to ask you a little bit this kind of battle cry for the need for public debate and public conflict. Do you have a sense in the Netherlands, in what we keep talking about, a culture of consensus of what we might imagine those spaces to be?
Yes, I think so. I'm not into the doom and gloom story. I guess that Rosi Braiditti just lay out a despairing picture of our democratic landscape. I'm reminded of the earlier discussion about how we could think about or decide about who belongs to this democratic circle. So who belongs and who doesn't? Who is a legitimate speaker in our conversation? And there was mention made by someone in the audience of Geert Wilders or Rita Verdonk, those kind of what we call populists. And of course, it's difficult to decide, and much of the discussion is concentrated around how would we decide, apart from the arguments that we can furnish for this, how do we decide whether these people belong to our democratic conversation or not? And some people, of course, simply think of populist movements as fascist movements in disguise. So they do not belong and should not belong to our democratic culture. I happen to think that they pose a challenge, a multiple challenge even, so it would be interesting to draw them in and to see what they are like in order to see what they can have to offer, even if they can offer nothing more than a challenge through which we can redefine our own politics. And I happen to think that left-wing politics is in a mess, that there is a hole, a big hole where left-wing thinking should be, and that we can profit from neoconservative and populist thinking, and also of the practices of those parties, in order to redefine who we are. And I do, if I may criticize a bit of, because we are friends, so it's also good to explore where we are adversaries. Rosi Braiditti tends, I think, too much to pitch this whole discussion at the level of as a cognitive issue. So he defines it as a cognitive issue. She speaks about a public cultivation of ignorance, about the necessity to define an epistemic sense of responsibility or cultivate it, critical intelligence, minimum amount of defining the terms of engagement. I think it's much more important to define the rules of engagement of people who we disagree with about the terms of engagement, people we do not want to call ignorant, because we want to first listen to what they have to say. So I think it's a danger in order to predefine, so to speak, our righteousness in this sense, our right sense of right and wrong, and not talk too much about stupidity beforehand, before we know what moves these people. And in this respect, I find it very important not to talk about fear as such, but about how fear is produced in people who have a certain sense of belonging to the Netherlands, as we all have, a certain attachment to the landscape and the institutions and the Queen. Not myself, because I'm a Republican, but anyway, many people do have this attachment, who now tend to think that it is under threat very much. And one of our writers, Geert Mak, has wrote in a pamphlet, and he coined the phrase "the merchants of fear," de handelaren in angst. And I think there's much merchandise or merchandising here of fear in our political scene and our intellectual scene, and we should be very careful not to call people stupid who listen to people who are able to articulate their sense of unease, let's call it a sense of unease about their lives, which they feel is under threat. But it is very much more complicated thing, and you can simply write off these people or the representatives as stupid, or rectify it by defining our terms. I think that what Chantal Mouffe has been trying to say, if I read it correctly, understand it correctly, is that if everything is political, these definitions or contests about defining who belongs and who is stupid and who is not are very much up for grabs and very much part of the contestation.
I have to Rosi respond, exactly.
He and I have been having this conversation for 20 years. We will be doing it for the next 20 years. First of all, I'm not at all into gloom scenarios, but I am critical, absolutely. And maybe it's also the difference in location, in having to deal with the effect of the public cultivation of ignorance and also of forgetfulness. I think the social construction of oblivion, to look at the effect of that on the students and the 20-year-olds that we get to the university, well, Dick knows this very well, with whom we are trying to do, whether it is a feminist education or human rights education or education for critical theory, we're trying to even establish there in a relatively formalized academic setting the rules of the dialogue. The effects are devastating. And if I cannot say that a Berlusconi or a Wilders is profoundly stupid, then I would really feel that I am letting down my sense of human standards and of human intelligence. It doesn't mean that I dismiss the people in charge, but there has to be some epistemic dimension to the rules of the dialogue, some demand for basic definition, for basic glossaries. What do you mean? So that we can engage into then what could be either the protocols of liberal democracy or parliamentary representation, or Habermasian protocols of, clear speech and whatever. But I mean, there has to be some commitment to not throwing language around emptily. There's been too much of that, and I think it is that inflation of terminology that allows finally a seriously, very dangerously clever right-wing politician like Sarkozy to clean the plate. He's really going to clean the floor with this, and he's going to take the inflation of so many of our concepts, freedom and Europeanness and whatever, and give it an injection of toxic material that I personally wouldn't care for. So I don't want to make it only an epistemic set of rules, but I do think there's some commitment, and we heard Paul Gilroy say this here last weekend, the importance of fighting this cultivation of ignorance and cultivation of oblivion. And I think it's one of the things that as an academic I can do. It's not the only thing, it's one of the things that we can do. Then the other thing is mapping. I am studying very carefully the phenomenon as a resident alien, as a foreigner within. I'm very fascinated by the phenomenon of Wilders, for one thing. I don't know whether you watched him on CNN when Christiane Amanpour interviewed him in the 3 series that she did, God's Warriors. There was the one on Islam, on Judaism, and the one on Christian fundamentalism. And I mean, Wilders came across as, it was an embarrassment for this entire country. I mean, she simply just looked at him and said, it's only Christiane Amanpour, but my Dutch patriotism, which as a non-native Dutch I have, and any proper native Dutch is mercifully free of any nationalistic patriotism. I just go berserk and would wrap myself up in the orange flag, a typical migrant with a strong identification. I was ashamed when he... I have also taken a pilgrimage to Pimford Town's grave because he chose to be buried in my home region. I'm from Friuli in Italy, from very near Pordenone. So I happened to be in Pordenone for a conference. I thought, I'm going to go there. And it was like a very interesting, I took pictures. It was a most interesting exercise to see where he chose to be buried, the size of the grave, the position of the grave, and the presents, loads and loads of little presents from Dutch people who use it as a pilgrimage site. And I took it extremely seriously. I think there is a whole story there about why he chose that place, which is very close to where Pasolini was born. It's Pasolini land, absolutely. And of course, he has his own connection there, etc. It has become a place of pilgrimage for the Italian right. The Fini and Co. went there recently. They have a kind of a Pimford Town Day to evoke this martyr of the great violence and the stupidity of the Netherlands who didn't appreciate him. So I'm tracking the phenomenon because I think it doesn't just belong to this country. It's such like a virus that spreads. But for me, this type of cognitive mapping, intellectual mapping, staying alert, vigilant, is the way in which I think I can best serve the debate, which doesn't mean that I only want to do this, but I think it's part of it. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank Thank you. I'd love to take some questions from the floor. Oh, come on. Last
we open
weekend.
the discussion on football and soccer, following from Paul Gilroy.
Exactly. We just get you the microphone, Chantal. Yeah.
I must say that I'm on the side of Dick on it, and I was really surprised to find such a rationalist tendency in Rosi, honestly. Curious. And in fact, I think you, well, in your last sentence, you use a word that really makes me, and I want to start with that. You say it's like a virus, you know, and I think this is precisely what is one of the problems with the way in which left-wing people have been reacting to the question of right-wing populism. They see it as some kind of moral disease, you know, something like a virus that spread, and they don't really try to understand, you know, or it's a question of ignorance, it's a question, honestly, I find that extremely arrogant, paternalistic, and because what we should try to understand is why is it that there are so many people who are attracted by those kind of parties and not dismiss them, you know. I remember the case I know best, and we've been in fact having discussion with Gerald about that for a long time, is the reaction in the rise, you know, and fortunately later the fall of come on, okay, you see, well, still alive, yeah, well, yeah, but he's not a danger for Austria anymore. But I remember when in 2000 the coalition was formed, you know, between the ÖVP, the Conservative, and Haider. I mean, the reaction all over Europe was so hysterical. A neo-Nazi party in power. It was completely absurd. This is not a neo-Nazi party in the least, you know. And of course, it was completely. And I remember something that shocked me immensely. I heard Elfriede Jelinek saying on the radio, we should not even speak with the people who have voted for Haider. That was 27% of the Austrian population, you know, and so those people, well, they were really, you know, like lepers, you know. We should not even speak with them. What does it mean? So those people are lost, you know. And I think the really important thing is to try to understand the reason for that, and I would say to make a real autocriticism, because I am absolutely convinced, it was certainly the case in Austria and in many other countries that I know, it is basically the left which is responsible for the growth of those movements. Because the left has not been really have stopped representing to the essays of people. I mean, for instance, socialist parties and labor parties are basically dedicated to the interests of the middle classes. You know, they don't at all interested in people who are you know, in this the most you know, fragile and the most threatened by the process of globalization, and the people. So they are not, you know, simply those demands are archaic, they are retrograde, they don't want to touch them. So it's not surprising, you know, that those people are attracted to parties who say that they are going to speak for them. So instead of having this kind of, you know, paternalistic attitude, say, we should really try to understand what have been the mistakes done by the left, why they've abandoned the representation of those groups, and what can be done in order to try to win them over, you know, not just write them off, but win them over. And in order to do that, one really needs to realize that they are serious problems which touch them and that need to be given an answer. And those are not, I don't really see the question in so much in epistemic terms. I think what is very important to take account is the role of affects in politics. And you know, it's not through rationalistic things, something, this is the good, this is the bad, that through the affects. And one cannot just simply intellectual impose those wonderful, I'm for instance completely critical of this post-national agenda of Habermas. I think that's, I mean, this is not going to work. It's all very nice in theory, but, you know, people are still very much, you know, as I was saying this morning, there is a very strong libidinal investment in those forms of identification.
But how, sorry,
yes.
how do you think you can educate the affects, educate the senses? Because that's what we're talking about.
Well, I don't like the term educate, because I think that's again patronizing, but one can encode them, one should give them, you know, because affect can be, well, of course, you could say so, but it's just the term educating, but they must be given a form of expression. I mean, some affects, it's the kind of, the discourse which are available, which will allow for some affects to be, you know, enclosed in some direction. And I think this is why as a political theorist, for instance, I'm so much concerned about the fact that democratic political theory is basically in all those forms we were discussing this morning, completely rationalistic, do not want to take account, you know, of this, which I call the role of passion in politics. But passion in a very specific sense, not individual passion, but passion to refer to the affective dimension which is at stake in a collective form of identification. You know, so this is not individual, but I think that in collective form of identification there is very strong affective dimension. That's what I call passion. And the political theorists, they don't want to touch that. They say, this is something, you know, which basically it can only be populist and it's fascist. And of course, in the case of Habermas, I do understand this reason, because he thinks, and of course, you know, the Nazi parties were strong in mobilizing passion. But it's not a reason for saying when we should not mobilize passion. The problem is that is how they are mobilized, you know. And passion can be mobilized through our justice, through our equality, through our many other things. But if you know, the left does not mobilize passion in that way, then those passions are there, available to be mobilized in other ways. And I think that's extremely important to have, you know, a possibility of taking this dimension into account.
Thank you, Chantal, thank you. I have now 4 or 5 hands flying up in response to all these things, and the first one is at the back here, and then Gerard after that, and yeah, okay. And Charles.
Well, thanks. I think I'm trying to look a way in between Dick and Rosi. I'm befriended to both of them, so I have to. I think that on the one hand, you could say that I am not confident, and I don't have enough patience to first listen to what really moves people from the extreme right. What really moves, for instance, Geert Wilders. I've heard him speak all the time, and Rita Verdonk also. I've studied them. I know enough. They are my adversaries. And so, but let me just first finish. Yeah.
No, but just to specify, I'm saying the people who are voting for.
Yes, and that's yes, I know, but that's what I wanted also then to address. I don't think that we should just only say that we really should first know what really drives the people who vote for him. These affects. For instance, there could be legitimate affects. What Chantal Mouffe was telling us, like the left has also ignored some concerns by people. On the other hand, we shouldn't be moved into that direction too much, I think, because that is exactly what the center-left parties are doing, and the center-right parties too. They're trying to think of a program which also appeals to the following of extreme right, and by that, in that direction, become themselves more strict regarding integration and immigration. So they feed into that. So I would also plead for what Rosi is saying, perhaps in a bit of a very radical way, is that also the following of extreme right for a large number of people are for the left, adversaries. And we shouldn't paternalistically educate them. Neither should we really feel for them, but you just contradict them. enter into a fierce debate and a discussion with them. So that would be my in-between.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Gerard, would you like to respond next? You can. Yeah, why not?
Well, that's very much my direction. First, I wanted to contradict Judith on a certain point, and that connects a bit with Chantal, but you said that we can't blame the rightist politicians for articulating the unease of the masses. Masses is my word. I mean, that's, we have to blame them because they're not articulating it, they are pushing it. They are pushing ressentiment. And that's where a great deal of the problem starts. Of course, it's a very complex situation of especially media populism, but also these subjects that push the whole discourse. And even you're right, attacking Chantal, attacking the left, because they also take this populist game over. But I think it's not articulating something which is there, but producing a discourse. And the second thing is not is maybe not referring to this last discussion, but referring to Rosi. It is about this. My problem with the idea of becoming European, you said, yeah? It's not becoming Europe, it's becoming European, is that even Negri uses some Deleuzian thought and really misuse it and instrumentalizes Deleuze, because Deleuze, of course, was very Europe critical on the one hand, and becoming, the concept of becoming had never to do anything with something like the European Constitution or something like representative democracy. So I don't really understand your optimism towards. I mean, it's a weird combination of, on the one side, you really sounded really civilization critical with these doom and gloom things and so on, and on the other hand, there turns up a very, very clear optimism on a side that I don't understand.
Thank you. Okay, one question here, and then we'll go to you, and then Charles. Okay.
Yes, I have a question for Mr. Vasif Kortun. You were just explaining how you had to deal with this Orientalism, we could call it, yeah, as from people from the ZKM, and also expecting these Turkish artists to represent something they don't necessarily want to represent or feel that they do actually represent. How do you, in your own practice as a curator and as director of Platform Guarantee, actually deal with this? Do you have any kind of response to it, and what is it? Thank you.
Take the floor.
I mean, this is really not complicated. It's you deal with the. I mean, what I meant to say is that if you bundle a range of work, and you could actually put, you can produce a different kind of narrative, always with a range of work, and whichever narrative you want to actually you want to produce. Even predicating even before seeing the work, you can actually, when you see and bundle certain works together, and most artists are, at the moment of inception of the exhibition, are not aware that, let's say, if there is a whirling dervish on a record player, which has to do with a completely different set of ideas, is put next to a work that seems to have an image of a minaret next to it, and then you have a different story. Yeah, I mean, this is what I mean. It's just it's this kind of curatorial practice that's what was wrong with most of these projects, or it's just picking one work out of the a range of works from the artist's career and just like building an exhibition on that kind of work to prove, a point about Islam or modernity. Usually it's about Islam, modernity, and women. Anyway, I mean, this is like the three things. that just keeps revisiting us all the time. I mean, me, anyway.
Thank you. Yvette, over here, the mic, please. Sorry, behind Nikos and then Nikos.
Yes, I have a question to Rosi Braiditti. There was a need for clarity. I am surprised that I still heard in this group the terms left or right, describing politics. Do you believe, and as you were asking for clarity in terms, do you believe that right and left are still dimensions of politics?
What prize do I get if I get the right answer? Dinner. My political coming of age is through feminism, anti-racism, and what used to be called the far left. So I have never really had, I have a heavy commitment to something of the left that I think Deleuze describes beautifully as a sort of a level of political intensity that is geared towards change and transformation. And I think that was far more alive in what used to be the extra-parliamentary left, the far left, than in the official left. I mean, the baby boomers, my generation has had a quarrel with the political left forever. I mean, I've never been a member of any parties, but I am culturally, passionately, to take Chantal's hint, effectively of that particular political culture. I come from Italy, a culture where fascism is deeply ingrained. So to be of the left in my home culture has a very much stronger kind of connotation than to be a lefty in the decent social democracies of the North. I remember visiting the last remaining Lenin Museum up in Tampere, Finland, and reading in one of the international meetings the Lenin's comments on the Dutch delegation. There was the Dutch delegates trying to bring communism to the country, and then he was commenting, how can a country that has had hundreds of years of decent government understand the tragedy of the proletariat? And I thought, that is just a fabulous wrapping up, speaking of the Becoming Dutch. I think in my home culture, being of the left means fundamentally being anti-fascist. I mean, historically, and that I can relate to. But as of the 60s on, as a feminist, as a kind of a foreigner, I've had nothing but a quarrel. I think today, the disappearance of the left-right, I mean, Bobbio has written about it, Giddens has written about it, that the difference may be minimal, is a fact. I think if I look at it in terms of civil rights, human rights, all of the stuff that I think that the political movements of the 70s have invented, then a difference of temperature and a different political affect is palpable. But if you look at their economic policies, etc., I'm not so sure. I prefer to think, and then I would like to take up your question, with an optimism of the will, that recomposing a political landscape along coalitions of, this is the Deleuzian language, affects and dreams for the future, possible scenarios, becomings, is that the contemporary version of that desire for change and transformation, which for me is something of the left. It really means injecting possible scenarios. This is why I'm not at all of gloom and doom, but I think that constructing concrete alternatives and injecting positive, affirmative passions out there in a culture that is fraught with melancholia and profound in inactivity, I mean, inertia, disaffection. I think that's what I also see in my students. So the Becoming European is not at all a recomposition of a steady identity. It's a project. It's a way of actually moving on, taking accountability for the places that we are responsible for the here and now, to ground it a little bit. It's a huge discussion, but I take it from Balibar, and I do think that Negri gets Deleuze wrong, but I think his attempt to make Europe part of the multitude is interesting. But then that would take another kind of seminar to go in that direction. So thank you, but I suspend.
Thank you. Charles is next. I have the mic here. And then Nikos.
Rosi, it's a question actually for all three of you in some ways, but it picks up on something that Rosi said, which is taking you back to your doom and gloom phase, I'm afraid, in the talk. And you mentioned it just at the end, and it's when you were talking in your presentation, you were talking about an absence of curiosity in this culture, in the Dutch culture, and an unwillingness to check facts. And recently, just now, you talked about inertia, and in a sense we could say, innovation as well, a kind of political innovation. And it's also related to Vasif's quote of Annie, I think, in terms of curating into a vacuum, the feeling often that there is actually nothing which emerges out of the consequences of our curation or our activity. And I suppose my question is quite simple. Can we start to unpick, and also to Dick, whether you identify this at all as a state in which the Netherlands has fallen into? And what is the explanation for this absence of curiosity? What is its relationship to populism, which I think might be a connection that we haven't quite explored in our talking about populism, an absence of curiosity resulting in kind of easy answers. But also for me at least is a question, what is its relation to post-social democracy, to the post-social democratic project, which I think we are in now, clearly a post-social democratic project, while we still proclaim the Netherlands to be social democratic, seems to me to be a conflict of understanding of this society, which produces kind of innovation or etiolation, kind of absence of passion, an absence of content as well, and an absence of curiosity about what that content might be. So my question is, why has that come about from your point of view? Does it have to do with the collapse of social democracy? Dick, do you recognize it at all as a description of the Netherlands? And secondly, if that's the case, then, and if not, why not? I mean, where is then, and that would be the second question, if you don't recognize it, then where is the sense of political agency? Where does that reside in the Netherlands now? Where is the passion? Where is the color? Where is the curiosity? If it's not within the current political field, which is at least something that Rosi suggested.
Well, first of all, we have not been that colorful in our political system and our political debates as, for example, the English have. So if you compare the lower house in The Hague with that in London, there are differences of passion, of course. So it's a bit of a national character to be modest, maybe not to be too outspoken. But I don't recognize this. Okay, it goes out of the roof then. Oh, all right. Second argument. I don't recognize the inertia argument or the absence of curiosity argument. There is an issue. I would rather say that that debate in Dutch about, for example, multicultural society has been very much advanced. Has been sharp and precise. Has been conducted rather long for a number of years, has been sharpened up by the appearance of Pim Fortuyn and his very strong rejection of multiculturalism and his warning about the Islamization of Dutch culture. And my sense is that we are in advance of other European countries in this regard, including England, where I'm almost fearing that the English, because of the quality of their public discussion, always are able to overtake us in anything. But in this case, I don't think they have, and this also goes for Germany. I don't know about France, but I would rather defend the Netherlands as a spot where, at the moment, the whole debate about Islam, about its integration into our democratic culture, is very far advanced, is very clear-cut, and answers to a rather high level. So, no, I'm proud of the Netherlands in this regard. Proud of our ability to dispute this in a still going through a couple of murders which have been connected with this issue. Can I say something about post-social democracy? And well, I've been involved in a number of years with the think tank. Also there I'm quite jealous of the UK, because you have all kinds of left-wing think tanks which are funded generously. And we have only one, or know of only one, which is our own think tank called Waterland, which is outside of the political parties, which so generally servicing the left in order to try to reinvent left-wing issues on a broad trajectory, seeing or answering to the challenge of neoconservative intellectuals, which is also a new phenomenon in the Netherlands. So a new challenge on the intellectual level, and to reinvent bits and pieces of the left-wing agenda, because I think that much of it is in need of repair. And we are indeed in a post-social democratic situation. And I for myself, am interested in even in going into politics and maybe founding a new political party which tries to find a new third way, another third way beyond social democracy, which takes up the notion of civil rights and human rights, the notion of what we call in the Netherlands vrijzinnigheid, so free thinking mentality, tolerance, reinvent the notion of tolerance, and reinvent also a notion which is very much in dispute between socialism and classical socialism and classical liberalism, which is the radical view of the equality of opportunity. If we could reinvent that radical view, radical notion of the equality of opportunity, or a radical notion of meritocracy, a social meritocracy, then I think we would be nearing a new agenda for the left. And I think left and right should be redefined, but should also remain in definition very much, even though I think that the distinction between, or the opposition between left and right is not the only one. I even think that we could learn in this regard from the populist movements, because they challenge us in thinking about the established party-based parliamentary system, and offer alternatives which are not very attractive, but force us to rethink what our own alternative would be, or our own view of a broadened, beyond, maybe thinking beyond the established political parties, beyond that system. So deepening the democratic system that we are having.
Would the other panelists like to respond to Charles's question?
Yes, rapidly. I recognize a lot of what Dick says, and I want to join forces with Bauke in suggesting that actually there's a lot of points in common. You talk about rethinking, redefining. That is the epistemic element of a much broader project. Rapidly on the general situation in the Netherlands, absolutely true that the public debate has been amazingly alive, brave, sustained over a long period of time. It has also been, to a certain degree, not orchestrated, but contained within pretty fixed parameters. There's been other voices have really had great difficulties emerging. One of those that I missed dramatically is the feminist voices, like that never existed, partly because the older generation of feminists sided with the clash of civilization and went anti-Islam. We've been blessed with Ayani Siali, so that also was quite an element in stopping a number of debates. Yes, but, and I think many of us have also tried to send in letters and have other voices heard. It wasn't so easy to get through. I think this is why we also took the road of the art world and the Dutch pavilion in Venice to try to make other voices heard. And it is, I repeat, a gesture of enormous faith and confidence in the resources that the country has to put on a show like this, saying there is another Holland, there are other voices. You mustn't just believe
Rosi,
that our political
you would dispute that Ayani Siali is a feminist? She falls out of your definition
I
of...
did not say that. I was saying that her intervention in the public debate prevented a number of feminist debates from emerging. You were either for or against. She is a civilizational warrior, so you first have to take a position and then you can enter the debate. And those of us who wanted neither to be against Islam, which she is, she's an anti-Islam feminist, nor for the clash of civilization, had nowhere to go. And because of the backing that she got from the right, Herman Phillips and all the right, she monopolized the public debate. No other voices could emerge. I mean, I know the woman, she's got her father living in Rome. I mean, she has not done this country a great service. I mean, that's all I can say. But we can have the debate at some other point. It wasn't about this. On the Dutch situation, I think there has been a post-traumatic element to this state of disaffection. I see this in my students. 2 political assassinations in whatever 3-4 years is a lot for a country that hasn't had any for 2 centuries. If it was in Italy, oh yeah, another assassination. But this is Holland. So I think that has been a post-traumatic disorder syndrome, which instead of having been dealt with a minimum sort of amount of even neoliberal kind of technology of the self or care of the self, we could have put a coaching program for the whole population. It has been turned into fear and turned into xenophobia, which hasn't done anybody any service again. The other element that I detect in what could be considered a serious element of the Dutch identity crisis is the sudden discovery that we are not so secular after all. And I think this is why the first lecture series that I did as part part of the new center that I ran in, it was on post-secularism. I think for the Netherlands, that is a shocker. I think for the left, that was a shock. We thought that maybe, and all of a sudden there, we were Christians, all of us, in denial or by deferral or by negation, but still connected on the Christian side of, even our definition of secularity is derived from our implicit Christianism. And I think that that is something that we need to address a lot more carefully. I mean, this is why we have a class of belligerent atheists led by Herman Philipson who are out there fighting for this, or Dawkins, I mean, they have them in the UK also, you know, fighting the cause of a new religion, atheism. So I think that this post-secular, post-traumatic and post-secular, I think, is ways of processing a deeper crisis. And I don't see many answers to this, because in the political class you have to take your position and then you can enter a debate. So a lot of us are silenced insofar as we have a complex relationship to the spiritual or the religious, to say the least.
Thank you. Nikos?
I'd like to make an observation which is which includes the whole panel and maybe a little bit of what has been said from the audience, in particular what Chantal added from the beginning, which is that it seems to me that there's a conflicting and contradictory models of political engagement that's being displayed today. And in those conflicting models of political engagement, there's also a strong, which hasn't been articulated yet, or a strong assumption about different ways in which pedagogy also is implied. How are we going to teach those who know less or more or differently, or see things differently to us? And so in a funny way, Chantal, I think the position you adopted was not that different from the position you're criticizing, which is, in a sense, you're saying, how do we win over rather than teach, which is the position Rosi was seeming to propose. And winning over still presumes an element of engagement which shows that one can win the other person from a different position, assuming a superior position. But so now, okay, this is the observation. But so now I want to inject into this observation a parallel line of trajectory that comes from thinking about artistic practice. If we understand one specific and very important part of artistic practice, in particular artistic practice that is evident in the final room of the exhibition Forms of Resistance upstairs, which is that there is no more an avant-garde. If we take that position seriously, and that the role of the artist is not to teach the other person what is enlightenment, not to show them what is beauty, but to engage with others in the discovery of knowledge and beauty, in that process of engagement is a social engagement, then we have a different model and a different way of thinking through some of these issues. And I think maybe this would be useful to combine the aesthetic models that are starting to emerge in the last 10 years with some rethinking of political engagement as well.
But why would you think that they are mutually exclusive, those models?
I didn't say they were mutually exclusive.
All right.
I was just saying that for the purpose of this discussion, they need to be reconnected. I think that they are being connected, in particular in examples like that was displayed in that final room. And but I think in the course of this discussion we've not kept them alive, perhaps enough.
But would it be okay to retranslate to a political vocabulary, to not to be so afraid of elitism or putting forward your own views in order to elicit responses to it from others? You have to make an offering. You make an offer as an artist, maybe as a politician, as an intellectual. You make an offer to a larger public, and then you see what happens. So this it must come with a certain view of righteousness, or a sense of what beauty is, what you define as beautiful, and what you think other people have a right to seeing or responding to it, in the very least. And I think the current politics, especially left-wing politics, lacks this notion of vision, putting forward your own views, sticking your neck out, which is the only way to elevate politics above populism.
Chantal would like to reply. Yeah.
Yeah, because well, you are right that in a sense, both Rosi and I, but from different point of view, one but I will change the view of people, win them over. But and in fact, that's related to a point I wanted to make also concerning an intervention and say they are adversaries. We are going to fight with them. Look, what I want to is to explain exactly what I understand by struggle for hegemony, because I think this will clarify the question. Obviously, it's true, in the struggle for hegemony, you want to your view to become the one which is accepted by the majority of the population. So you want people to change their position and move to your side. But I don't think it's a question of education, because I don't start from a kind of, epistemic view. I don't think that my view is more correct, and in fact, here I want to insist, and it's some kind of autocriticism to myself. We people on the left tend to believe that we've got the truth. And the truth that we are going to, disseminate, I think that's absolutely wrong. And we've got to abandon this idea that we've got the truth, that our mission is to, we need to accept that, in fact, precisely the agonistic struggle consists of saying nobody has got the truth. There is no truth. There are different views which are, in competition, and of course, I am identified with some view on the left, and here I will agree with what Rosi has said, why this passionate involvement, okay, but, I don't believe that I'm superior for that to somebody who is in a different position. I think it's very important to abandon this idea that we've got the truth, we are going to impose it, and then, of course, once this has been imposed, nobody can ever put that into question. I remember, several years ago, was a conference with a Latin American. It was an ex-guerrilla who said, the people have got the right to the counter-revolution. And I say, yeah, why not? I mean, it's true. If you really, so it's a question of winning people over, of course, to the certain values that you want, because you did. But of course. And I think what you say about artistic practice is very relevant. In a sense, it is something that, we are not going to impose an already, made view. We are going to learn also from them. We are going to discover with them what will be the best way to put in practice those views of equality. But in order to do that, I think it is very important to listen to the demands of the people, and listening to those, and among them to the people who are voting for right-wing populist parties, because most of those people are people from the popular classes, which we want in our hegemonic project, you see. But listening to them doesn't mean to do what they want, because of course there is a difference between the way they express their demand today, which of course is very much influenced through a xenophobic vocabulary, because the only people who really seem to be interested in what they demand are the right-wing populists. But try to see what they express in a vocabulary and in a way that we don't accept, what is behind that. And I think in most cases they are really what I would call democratic demands. But those democratic demands, if they don't have the vocabulary available, to be expressed in a, let's say, progressive way, then of course it's going to be expressed through right-wing populist discourse. So I think it's And of course, it's not a question of saying, well, we are adversaries, we are going to fight them. We need, I mean, some people are, the leaders are adversaries, but the people who follow the movement, we really want, you know, to persuade them, to win them over, but in order to do that, we need to understand their demands.
Thank you, Chantal. Okay, I'm just going to take a last response from Rosi.
Page 25 of the glossary, in the definition of museum, the Becoming Dutch team writes, the museum is a permanent institution in the services of society and its development, open to the public, which acquires, conserves, researches, communicates and exhibits for purposes of study, education, enjoyment, the tangible and intangible evidence of people and their environment. I wish I could say the same of the university, and I can't. This is why I'm here.
That's a nice note to end on. Thank you very much to all of our speakers, to Vasif, to Dick, and to Rosi. Thank you very much. I would like to say one small thing actually about the dictionary, just so you know. This is a small publication which was our attempt, as Rosi explained, to grapple with certain terms and terminologies. It's a book that says on the back, best before. So the idea is that we will make another one, that we will hopefully, through these debates, sharpen our terms. There is also the possibility to respond to the dictionary on our website, to add your own, to fight with our terms, to suggest different ones. So please feel free to engage in that part of the project too. We're going to maybe have a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back for the final presentation. Thank you.
Of course,
all right. Welcome back, everybody. Now we're going to have our final presentation of the evening, and we're very, very delighted to welcome here Malu Halasa, who's an editor and a writer based in London. Her recent books include Creating Spaces of Freedom, Culture and Defiance, and Transit Beirut Now, and Using Other Images. Sorry, can't read my own writing. Oh, sorry. Beirut, New Writing and Images. Apologize, I can't read my own writing at this point. And Malu is, we've always invited somebody to kind of think through practice at the end of the day. It's very important to bring that back up. So we're really delighted that she's agreed to give a presentation today. And her presentation is called Religion versus Facts on the Ground. So thank you very much, Malu.
Well, I'm going to show pictures, and my presentation isn't going to be as theoretical as you've heard today. Really, what I'm going to be looking at is religion versus facts on the ground, as seen through the books that I do as an editor and writer on the Middle East. But first, a short preamble. Religion has become more contentious, and I'd like to use the word boisterous. Perhaps there have always been, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, issues surrounding religion. But today's 24-hour news has made the reporting of religion an important part of the current affairs agenda. So religious issues, whether it's the teddy bear named Muhammad or the Danish Muhammad cartoons, are now beamed and reported across the world, and within a few hours of the event taking place. And what this has done, particularly in my field, doing visually led books about the Middle East, what this has done is that many people who have no experience of the Middle East, Iran, or the rest of the Arab world, they have very set preconceived notions about Islam and the way people live and act there. On the other side of the discussion is the phrase facts on the ground. And this is an expression that has a very unique political pedigree. It was coined by former Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon. It refers to Israel's growing infrastructure in the West Bank, and before Israel's unilateral withdrawal from the Gaza Strip, Sharon's facts on the ground, specifically the settlements and the wall, or the security fence, could not be dismantled and would have to be taken into consideration. It was unmovable and unassailable. These facts could not be overlooked when and if final status negotiations were to take place. Now, not even a week after the negotiations, or the kickstart of negotiations in Annapolis, the recent meeting in the U.S. with the Palestinians and the Israelis and various representatives of the Arab world looking on, the Saudis and the Syrians, that the current Israeli Prime Minister, Ehud Olmert, expressed his fears that Sharon's facts on the ground, with Sharon's facts on the ground, Israel would find it increasingly difficult to justify itself as the Jewish state as the Jewish state starts to include a growing Palestinian demographic, which would lead the state into a situation of religious apartheid. So now even the Israelis, or some of the Israelis, are thinking that Sharon's facts on the ground, these things that they built, that they said were going to last forever, maybe those are going to change. So these facts are, apparently non-negotiable. And it turns out that they're actually maybe changeable and fluid. So on one hand, we have facts that are changeable and fluid and can be erased or their face can totally change. And on the other hand, we have religion, which isn't, some people would say are based on facts, but religion, ideas about religion, preconceptions about religion are being carved in stone now. My books, in 2005, I did 3 proposals, and one of them was on the Iranian photojournalist Kaveh Golestan. Kaveh Golestan was the Iranian photojournalist with the longest continuous presence in Iran from before the revolution until 2003, when he stepped on a landmine. He was on assignment for the BBC in northern Iraq, in Kufri, northern Iraq. These photos that I'm going to show now are from 1980 to 1988, and it's from the Iran-Iraq War. The Iran-Iraq War is, for the most part, the forgotten war in the West. Mainly because during the 1980s, Saddam Hussein was our man in the Middle East. The Americans, the British, and anyone else who wanted to get on board. So they didn't really challenge Saddam Hussein, and they also, during the Iran-Iraq War, they tooled up Iraq quite heavily against Iran, because the Iranians have always been, for various reasons, historic reasons, the Iranians have always been on the quote, the wrong side. These pictures, Kaveh Golestan was 8 miles outside of Halabja when the Iraqi jets flew over and dropped, a lethal mixture of nerve gas and toxic chemical agents, and caused significant damage. Golestan rushed there. He took photos. Kaveh Golestan worked for Time magazine. He worked for a lot of British newspapers. He won a Robert Capa Award for his pictures. But his photographs of Halabja, they were, I think maybe one was published, and it was of a child. And it's almost as if, when I think of Kaveh Golestan's work, because he remained so closely tied to Iran, and that he documented from prostitutes and migrant workers under the Shah and to the revolution, the Iran-Iraq War, to dervishes in the Zagros Mountains, he really was close to what was happening on the ground. He recorded what he considered the truth about Iran and facts on the ground. But it's almost as if notions of religion and notions of Iran prevented his work from getting a wider audience. Sorry. So that this is always the problem I have with the books that I do, is that I want to show culture, I want to show art, I want to show personal experience from the Middle East, whether it's Iran or from the Middle East. And I go around to the book fairs, I go around to publishers, and I show them very good visual material, and people will say to me, one of the editors at Thames and Hudson has said to me in the past, this stuff is really interesting. is what people need to see. But because of the publishing industry at the moment, there's a real problem in trying to get this material out. So I have to rely on funding, and one of my main funders that I go to when I have a book idea that I'm really fired up about, and I feel that it needs to be shown, I go to the Prins Claus Fund in the Netherlands. I started working with the Prins Claus Fund in 2000, and Creating Spaces of Freedom is one of their books, because they were looking for an editor to finish it. And I come out of alternative press in America, where I grew up, but also lifestyle magazines in Britain, and just my own family background of being an Arab Filipino. I'm very interested in different parts of the world. But it was really working for the Prins Claus Fund that I kind of developed my own philosophy, that I wanted to do these books that I felt very strongly about, and somehow I would push them through. And the only way that I can push them through is that I go for funding, and I don't go for, as I was talking to someone earlier, I don't go for a lot of funding. Matter of fact, hardly anybody on the team that works with me, we don't really make a living wage, but we try to push it through, and in that way we're able to find publishers. We give them the package. And sometimes we go to publishers and we give them the whole package, and they're still not interested, because they really do believe that people in Holland, people especially in Britain, people in the United States will not be so interested in reading about these areas of the world, even when these are areas of the world that allegedly threaten, the Western world. The second book that, I'm sorry, I'm jumping ahead of myself. These are Basijis, that young men that went to fight during the Iran-Iraq War. And this was also a photograph that Golistan had taken on the front of a woman handling a Kalashnikov. But when the picture was published in The Guardian, a reader wrote in and said, well, she's handling the Kalashnikov wrong. So there's obviously, was a stage picture. Another book that I've been doing, sort of, one of the other projects from 2005 was that I have my own series. It's called Transit. And Transit is really a showcase of new writing and images from the cities that I'm very interested in. So I did a Transit Beirut, and we showed, again, young people, journalists, famous novelists, photographers, they were all kind of lumped together in an anthology to give a flavor of what Beirut is like. Well, I've just finished the next Transit with Maziar Bahari, who had a retrospective, I think earlier this week in Amsterdam. He's an Iranian documentary filmmaker, also a special correspondent for Newsweek. And Maziar and I, because Transit, I sort of felt that working on the Kaveh book was very interesting, but Kaveh was sort of an older generation, and I was very interested in young Iranians now. This is a photo essay by Kian Amani. Amani is a young photographer and filmmaker. He was educated in Iran. One of his first jobs was that he worked in an art house that was next to a large park in Tehran. So he started watching these benches in the park, and this is his story of the benches. He watched the benches for 2 years. This picture, you can see a young couple, they're there together, they're looking at their mobile phone. Someone from the park police sees them and comes and joins them, or is watching them, and then he starts talking to them. And he's asking for identification. And the woman is showing her ID, and he's taking that, and he's leading them away, because young couples aren't able to really to sit together in a public park. And then he takes them away, and the last picture of the photo shoot is, again, a new couple on the bench. This is you could sort of put this and say this is a facts on the ground and kind of, quotes, but it's because of people's preconceptions about Shia Islam and what's going on there, that we never really get to see a young person's view. Another one of the stories that we're showing in the anthology is about women police officers. And these are pictures by Abbas Khosari, who was able to attend a demonstration of one of the first graduating classes of women police officers in Tehran. And they're giving a demonstration that they hold guns, they abseil, you know, they climb up buildings, and they also can handle heavy guns. But these pictures are quite humorous and they're quite fun, and they were taken during a demonstration. But the reality of these women police officers is that other contributors to the book, one of them who's written an article about a group of women who are trying to storm the men-only football stadiums. She talks about these women police officers, and they're very brutal. So on one hand, they definitely do like subvert our ideas about women in chadors, but on the other hand, they do the things that we don't really like, that they stop women on international Women's Day from protesting. And so it's sort of interesting the way that people react to the imagery. Now, this is a book that I'm doing. My third title that I did the proposal for in 2005 is a book on Syria's racy lingerie culture. It must have been like 2003, 2004, when I was doing Transit Beirut. Rana Salam is a Lebanese graphic designer and artist. And when we were doing Transit Beirut, she said, oh, we should do something on Syrian lingerie. You know, that was the time that Syria was in control of Lebanon. But for whatever reason, that story didn't happen. And Rana and I started talking, and I said, well, should we try to do a book on Syrian lingerie? Syria is an axis of evil country, just like Iran, and Syria has a racy lingerie culture. Now, these photographs that I'm showing, this is how the lingerie is sold in the souk and in women's department stores. Lingerie photographers are hired by the lingerie companies. It's a small industry. You know, we estimated like 200 firms, and it's a cottage industry. So the factories which we visited are like in the basement of buildings. They take pictures of women, usually non-Arab, usually Eastern European, and from what we can glean, they're prostitutes. But they take pictures of these women in the lingerie, and these photographs are distributed very openly all over the souk and in the stores. When we were buying and shopping for lingerie and talking to the people at the very beginning of the research project. You know, we would go to any sort of stall, and they would give us a photo album filled with these sorts of pictures of women showing, because if you hold up the lingerie, you know, if you hold up the lingerie, it doesn't look like very much. Just sort of like bits of feathers or plastic, you know, or if you press it, maybe it will have a song that it sings, or lights that flash like that. So there's a kitschy side to this also. This book, of the three, has been one of the most problematic to place. Publishers are, yes, they're intrigued by it, and they think their readers would be intrigued by it, but they also worry about a number of things. One of them is that if by showing these pictures they're somehow, you know, incurring the wrath of Islam, or really issues about women and being covered up, that they feel that when you talk about if you talk about an industry, a cottage industry in a country like Syria, which is predominantly 60% Sunni Muslim, that really to show this, you're courting a fatwa. They're very worried about that. We had our first publisher. It was the art publisher Scalo, a Swiss publisher. They went bankrupt, and the book was delayed. After a year or so of looking for more publishers, it's been picked up by Chronicle Books in San Francisco. But Chronicle has been very careful. You know, I have also other pictures of Muslim women modeling, not this kind of lingerie, but Syria also has a very serious cotton lingerie industry. So there are Muslim women who are models, who are modeling. And in a way, to show only this is to say that, you know, that this is the only type of lingerie they have in Syria. Really, you need to show the whole gamut of it. But the Chronicle says, no, we're not going to publish any pictures of Muslim women as models because that really will cause offense. So there's always this question about if you're really allowed to show. These preconceptions about Islam and the hijab are so strong that even when you show them something that you've gathered that's openly available in Souk al-Hamadiyya or in the souk in Aleppo or in the women's clothing stores, publishers, Western publishers still can't get their heads around it. They expect Islam to be prudish. That's what they expect. And that, I think, I think that these preconceptions really do obscure what's happening on the ground, or these, you know, facts that are changeable on the ground. This is a young woman. Maybe that's not the best picture. These are not the best pictures to show. This is a man, Ibrahim. A man, Ibrahim, is going to be in the lingerie book as a coda at the end. Imam is she's a Bedouin Syrian. She comes from a family of she has 16 siblings. Her father married twice. Their family lives on the eastern outskirts of Syria. And Imam, highly unusual, lives by herself in Aleppo. Imam is an artist and a poet, and although she wears the hijab in public, she takes pictures of herself in her bedroom and she writes poetry. Her inclusion in the Syrian lingerie book has caused enormous kind of nervousness on the part of the US publisher, because they also feel that, well, she's a Muslim woman, so, you know, how do you frame it? Do you say, you know, in the book, I don't say that she has 16 sisters and brothers. I don't say that her father has 2 wives, because I sort of feel Western artists, we don't go into that. We don't say that about. We don't give like a full family history to somehow explain the work. But just telling you now, her work, her poems and her pictures, they kind of border on teenage, middle 20s angst. You know, she's like any other girl, really, but within the context of Syria, she becomes unusual. But we had met Imam and we had seen her work like long ago, and we kind of felt that it was important to give, not only to show Eastern European models, women modeling racy lingerie, but it was also important to give space for someone who's Syrian and who's an artist and who's working there in that country. And these books, I think, I don't know if they'll change perceptions about the Middle East, but my work, I'm sort of very committed to trying to push the envelope a little bit, so that the only pictures the only visuals that we see from the Middle East are usually of war, or it's civil strife in Palestine, or women in hijabs. I think one of the most influential exhibitions that happened about a year and a half ago in Britain was of Muslim young women in hijabs. They were playing pool, they were playing soccer, they were doing all sorts of things. And although the British public didn't really react that much to it, when the exhibition went to Saudi Arabia, the Saudis were very intrigued by it, because of the way that Saudi women are not allowed such an active public life. But these are my books, and this is what I do. But I think that I wouldn't have gone down this road, and I wouldn't have tried to explore the topics that I try to explore, if not for my involvement with the Prince Claus Fund. That was something that was very important to my work. So in a funny way, becoming Dutch or becoming European, although I spent my first 25 years in the States, I sort of feel that even though I don't recognize some of the Dutch traits that I think are Dutch in my mind because of my work with the fund, I think I've become Dutch, and I think I've become European. And I think that my books show not only the culture of the Middle East and maybe what's happening here and now there, at this moment, but also that they invite the rest of the world to come in and take a closer look. Thank you.
Silence. There we go. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Malu. That was really interesting. Articulation of your position and what you're trying to do in terms of your practice. The thing that kept running through my head as you were talking was actually Vasif's presentation earlier, and this thinking, this very careful thinking about to whom one is creating a visibility. What audience is one sort of projecting images into, and what desires are getting played out by that audience. So I'm quite interested to know, indeed, I mean, we can talk more about the specific themes and the specific places and why you feel engaged with those particular places, but who is the audience for these books?
I thought the audience for these books would be people who are interested in people, I don't know.
Maybe you have to pull the microphone closer.
Artists, people like me, visual, people who have an interest in print, but also is interested in the marriage between words and images.
But I mean, even geographically, I mean, are these things that are specifically getting distributed to the West, a bit like what Vasif was talking about, how the West played out its sort of Orientalism of Turkey?
We try to get them distributed in the West. The Kave Golistan book came out last month, and we're still waiting for Hachakants to kind of push it out there. We're hoping that we get we aim for distribution. Transit Tehran is going to have a German language edition, and either it came in my email yesterday or I'll know by Monday. I've been courting Princeton Architectural Press to get them interested because they do hip books. They're smart. And I don't know who their readers are. Actually, I guess I should worry more about my readers. I don't really care who my readers are. What I care about is that when you go to the library, if you're interested in Iran, you don't get just academic books. You don't just get a certain kind of book. That you get the image and words together, so that you can kind of see something other than what's being told to you by me or by Maziar or by other. I mean, maybe I should think more about.
No, I just was interested in his critique specifically of what the West was playing out its own sort of desires and wishes and questions, rather than attending perhaps to the practices and where they were located. So I suppose I'm just trying to phrase it in that.
No, I think you're right, but I see that more with Syrian lingerie. With Syrian lingerie, people are very intrigued. They're very curious. They want to know. I'm invited more to talk more about it. That's why I didn't start with it today, is because I noticed that when I start with a naked woman, like I've got everybody's attention right away. They're really gripped. And I should start with a naked woman, right? Because I should grip you instead of being really boring at the beginning. But there's something in me, there's a feminist in me that says, I'm not going to do that. You got to go through a bit of a slog and a little bit of theory and then come to it. And then if it comes by really fast and you don't get it, well, too bad. You know, maybe you'll get the book. But maybe that's the way, because it's so hard to do the books, it's so hard to find the funders, because it's so hard to talk a book is an infinite, I don't have to tell you guys curate, you know this, but a book it's an infinite space. And you can't do a book, one mind is not enough for a book. You need more minds on it, and not just editors and copy editors, but everybody kind of becoming involved. And these are places of the world, you know, I may go to Syria and I may go regularly to Syria, but I don't know it like someone who lives there. So I rely on everyone to become involved in that. So my audience, I hope that my audience is going to be the academic university, people who go to the university. But I'd also like people who read The Sun to get into the tabloids in Britain. I'd like them to review the books.
Would you also welcome a kind of, if you're doing a book which is centered around something that's happened in Tehran, for there to be a discussion in Tehran about the book?
Definitely, definitely. And one thing...
Does that happen?
Well, Transit Tehran hasn't come out yet. And we're trying to get the Kaveh Golestan, because Golestan, what's interesting about Golestan was that he worked a lot for Western newspapers, but he would do gritty realism stories about what was going on in Tehran under the Shah or what was happening during the revolution. So he was very rooted there. He did a documentary called Recording the Truth about the situation for journalists in Iran. And he was told, and it was broadcast on Channel 4 in 1991. He was told by Iranians that he knew, don't come back to the country, you'll be in trouble. 6 months later, he went back. And he was put under house arrest, and he lost his work permit, and he had no freedom of movement. The only place he could go for a couple days every few days for 2 years is he went to the Ministry of Ershad and signed in. And then after 2 years, the government said, okay, you can go teach art at Tehran University. So a lot of the Iranian visual artists, photographers that are working today were Golestan students. And Kian Amani, he won the 2007, I think, Kaveh Golestan Photographic Award. So even though the government didn't really like what Golestan did, they did make a space for him. And we're trying to get the book into Iran now, and we think that we can do it. And also there is a cultural arts program, books program. The Iranian government, they do not make their own discussion programs and arts programs in English. They farmed it out to 2 Iranian producers in London. And now we're trying to make sure that the book will have a half-hour slot on their program. So we don't want it, it's not diaspora. My contributors at Transit Tehran and the Golestan book, these are people on the inside, and some on the outside, but the outside, they're going home a lot. We wanted to get their point of view across. We felt that was important.
Thank you. I'd like to open it to the floor for some questions. There's one just back here. Just wait for the microphone. Thank you.
I would like to know in which way, knowing that in Syria they also, women also like to wear lingerie, can give me an idea about, hint more about their society, and about not an orientalized idea about the society as well. And the second, you mentioned the fact that you became Dutch today.
Oh,
can you tell me in which sense? What does it mean for that? Okay, thanks.
Well, the first thing was that I guess I was sort of interested in it because I had never, I had walked in the souk a lot. I started going to Damascus when I was 16. And I've been through that souk, and I didn't notice any lingerie at all. Matter of fact, I hardly noticed anything. But I think because it was just like, walking through an Oriental souk. When Rana Salam pointed it out to me, and it just seemed very interesting that there was this sort of cottage industry. The Syrians are known as the Chinese of the Middle East, but they're also known as having a much more raunchy, upfront kind of humor. And in the book, I interview various Syrian commentators, and they tell me some of the very popular jokes. So, I mean, what does that tell you about Syria? It tells you that it's like any other place. They have lingerie, they tell dirty jokes, and then this idea that everything's segregated or that everyone's oppressed and no one can say their feelings, well, it's wrong. People do say. Now, we also have essays. We have an essay in the book by Nora Kevorkian, who's a Lebanese-Armenian filmmaker who lived during the Civil War. Her family moved over to their Syrian family side. And she writes about low-income women and their relations with their husbands, so that you do get a sense that the different relations between people, it also has to do with class. I think that people have such a, I don't know if it's a blinker, I don't know what it is, but such a sort of wall between when they think about the Middle East, that they don't think about it in the way that we think about, you know, Britain or France or Europe, in terms that it's, you know, that there are different political divisions, that there are class, that gender is, some of the gender politics is class-based. You know, it's almost like you recreate the wheel, or that's how it seems to me, because we assemble the material, we send it, we have a very, very good editor at Chronicle, but some of her questions, some of the questions from Scalo, it makes you think that people don't really see the Middle East as the way that you'd see other places. And it is really because Islam stands kind of right, their preconceptions of Islam stand right in the way. But what does that say about Syria? I don't know. What was quite interesting was that we were interviewed for a short article in Time magazine about Syrian lingerie, and it was picked up by an Israeli politician, Yossi Sarid, who writes for Haaretz, and he wrote this editorial, and the title of the editorial was "The Future is in Underwear," and he talked about how, well, the Syrians, they like sex, they like underwear. Hey, guess what? We like sex and underwear. We can make peace with them. And I thought, if that's the only thing Syrian lingerie does, it's okay. It's done a lot. And in terms of your second question, becoming Dutch, I think, I was asking you this before, how come I come to this country, and I come really regularly, like 3-4 times a year, I'm here for whether projects or attending something, and how come the level of discussion about immigration, multiculturalism, diversity, it's much more advanced here. Or maybe England had that discussion a decade ago, and we created, some artists came out of that, or some academics like Stuart Hall came out of that, but we don't see them. I haven't attended in a museum context this kind of forum in Britain. And I'm just wondering how come, and that's why I sort of feel, I don't know, Dutch.
They're not that normal here either.
They're not, well, as you say, they're not that normal. It must be the company I keep. It's good, the Dutch company's good. But that's why I was saying that I feel that even me with my heavy American accent, I feel more European. And I definitely feel that my interest, I don't think I would be doing the books that I'm doing now if I hadn't worked for the Prince Claus Fund.
Can I actually ask you something in relation to that? It was interesting last week when Els was here. There was a kind of interesting critical moment, and I think it's something that we're constantly busy with in terms of thinking curating and thinking visibility and all those complexities of thinking identity, which was, at one point she talked about kind of the transnational sort of scope of her, of the fund, and she talked about attending to places that were socially and economically, I think, and politically maybe complex. This was the phrase. And Charles immediately kind of replied with his presentation, which was actually about the citizens and subjects, and he was saying, well, I'm very interested in the social, economic and political complexity of the Netherlands, that there's an active process sometimes of looking away. And so I'm curious about whether you actually are interested in attending to those visibilities where you might be in the world.
I am.
Because that's often harder somehow.
That is often harder. Someone has asked me to do a book on Muslim popular culture in Europe. And this person who suggested the book to me gave me that he called it liberated Islamic culture, which I'm not really sure whether I agree with it or not. And I used to, when I was in the States, I worked for Rolling Stone, and then I met my husband who's British, and I came over. When I went over to Britain, I was like one of 2 people, this is 1980, I was one of 2 people who wrote about rap. So I spent a lot of time with, like, I don't know, Public Enemy and De La Soul and people like that. And it was really Public Enemy that made me start thinking about, well, if I'm writing so much about their history, I should write about my own history. And in a way these books that I'm doing now, even though I'm not Iranian, it's a way for me to kind of access my family culture, although my father's Jordanian, my mother's Filipino, but I can kind of access the things that I really like about the Middle East. I can celebrate, but also I can be critical about in the books. Going back to liberated Islamic culture, that would mean that I have to focus more on Europe. And I was wondering if I don't feel the fire. I mean, I'm sure that all of you here, whether you're working in visual arts, you're doing books, or you're doing exhibitions, or you're making work, you feel a certain kind of fire about it, and that fire will carry you through 3 years. You can go through 2 years looking for funding if you feel the passion and the fever. It doesn't really matter, but I don't feel it yet, and I know that book would also require a lot of contributors, a way to find how to pay them something decent.
What it might, though, allow for is an embedded knowledge of your own, rather than a kind of, you know, I mean, what's tricky, I suppose, or what I'm trying to pull out a little bit, is this idea of Vasif's, of how we're playing out certain desires by visiting elsewheres.
Maybe, but my elsewhere is like Midwestern America with 2 parents that couldn't really communicate well in English together. I mean, if I'm going to really play out, I should do my family memoir that I'm thinking about writing. Like that's more. But I sort of feel that culture now. I mean, I found it interesting that I think it was Chantel that said that art cannot be the only place where these sort of interventions can take place. We need it society-wide, but I sort of feel that art and culture are the only arenas where this kind of, these interventions are taking place, that we're having these sorts of discussions here in this kind of forum. We're not having them, they're not going on in the Houses of Commons. They're not going on in the newspapers. I mean, you can walk along the hall in the museum, and there's a British Peter Kennard, who does, you know, British collage and politically engaged art, and he was in the newspapers. Those newspapers and magazines, they don't exist anymore. I mean, they're there, the Guardian's there, the New Statesman's there, but that sort of discussion, that kind of insightful view is no longer there. Print has dumbed down. Newspapers have I mean, in Britain, they become smaller. There's less space. There's less space, and there's more space for free content. You know, that's what's happening. So these sorts of books are kind of, they're hard to do, but I think all of us should, if we want to do politically engaged work or politically engaged cultural work, the time is now to do it.
Thank you, Malu. I could take maybe one more question. That's you, yeah.
Thank you. I was in Iran also, and in Aleppo, and I was walking in the souks, and I saw those very small shops where men were selling this underwear.
Yeah.
And I wonder, did you think about, or perhaps you did, that you also make pictures of those shops and put it in the... Yes, you did?
Yeah, we have pictures of those shops and those religious
because
men.
It's a little bit, you know, it's a little bit uneasy for me when I see it, and then I know also the other side of the story with those small shops and those men hiding and selling this underwear and it.
Well, the underwear, racy lingerie, is a small industry that's run by the most conservative religious families, and their clientele are the most conservative religious young women getting married. And that's their clientele. I mean, I interviewed men who, you know, made the Hajj, all sorts of religious men. I mean, I was in one shop in Aleppo that the workforce, the people who were working, they had to stop really talking because they had to go to the mosque and pray. Mm-hmm. To them, there is no contradiction between selling the lingerie and the lingerie and sex after marriage. This is not an industry that promotes premarital sex in any way. They're very conservative about that. And what was really, really interesting recently was that one of the last things I had to do for the Chronicle book is they asked me to bring in quotes from 10 Syrian women. Most of the work for the book had taken place not this year, but last year or a year and a half ago. So there are some, of course I have Syrian friends that I could call, but I wanted to show visuals from the book to women I didn't know, who didn't know Rana, and get their response. And what was sort of interesting was that upper middle class to upper middle class women, they were very dismissive of the lingerie because it's not really part of their, it's not part of their culture, it's not part of their, they don't use it. They said they didn't know anyone who used it. But there was a group of women, Syrian women, who were involved in a photographic project where they had been given digital cameras. And I had asked the woman who had run that to ask this group of women that she knew very well. And their stories were quite interesting about how sexuality is perceived by their Muslim friends as opposed to their Christian friends. And even one Christian woman was saying, well, you know, before I couldn't look at the lingerie and I thought it was this or that or dirty, but after talking to my friends about it, maybe I should try something. Yeah. So it's interesting how the women themselves come to it. So yes, there is a contradiction in the way that it's sold, but in the way that it's marketed and the people who buy it, that's why it's like that.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, unless there's Rana, yeah. No, please do, because we can't hear upstairs otherwise.
Yeah, well, it's the end of the caucus, and I am too angry, and I can't take this anymore, but I just want to say something that I am happy that it is difficult to publish this book. And well, I want to give one example that once we were going to Sudan and a group of artists and students, and there was someone who was giving us a lecture before we went, and she said, the people in Sudan are, although they are black, although they are very tall, but they are very gentle. Do not have any preconceptions about them. They are very gentle. And I put this kind of work in the same category in a way that I find it too Orientalistic, and I'm Lebanese and I do not want to see that.
No, that's okay. You can suggest that it is, but without reading the text and without seeing the full scope of the pictures, I only showed one aspect of the book. There's another aspect where we use a fine art photographer to really just photograph the lingerie. There are pictures, I mean, Iman Ibrahim's in it. I mean, that's what I found with the women who I was asking for quotes from, is that somehow they thought that because we look at this, we're trying to make some kind of general statement about Arab womanhood or Syrian womanhood. Or that
sorry, I'm not talking about womanhood, or I'm not talking about the subject. I'm talking about how you and many other people approach it. I appreciate the intentions. The intentions are very nice and everything, but I mean,
I don't know. Maybe the intentions aren't so nice. Who knows? We'll see.
No, I can see that you intend something. You have good intentions, but in the end, a very Orientalistic way of thinking is embedded in how...
You have to explain to me how my thinking is Orientalistic.
Well, if you are trying to show something that is the opposite of what is the preconception about the Middle East, well, before I came to Holland, I never had any idea that someone might think that, well, I was never called an Arab before I came to Holland, of course, in a way that here, all of a sudden, I'm looking at people who are trying to talk about me, and
I've always called myself an Arab. Yeah. I mean, I think coming from Lebanon, when I can understand that. Like, I can sort of understand what you're saying, but I don't know. I guess it has something to do with my own identity. Rana noticed the lingerie because that's what Rana Salam does. You can look her up. It's www.ranasalam.net. She's a graphic designer. She's really into packaging and ephemera, and that's what she does. But I don't really know how. I tried very carefully not to be Orientalist, but maybe we are.
Okay, one last question from the back here.
I was just curious if you have any thoughts about using the internet to stay like more independent from the publishers, and if you really are having this fire of expressing this, as you talked about.
I haven't explored that yet. Like in terms of, you know, many people have websites and everything. I haven't really done that. Rana Salam has a website. I haven't really looked into, I mean, as everyone, I'm sure you've read about the new e-book device that Amazon has created that you could put 30 books on or something. And I thought, well, that's interesting, but I would, maybe I'd rather have the book, but maybe with diminishing resources, we can't have the book. Maybe my whole relationship with print is quite an old-fashioned one. In terms of that really I should be thinking about new technology. And in that way, you cut out the middleman. You don't have to go to Frankfurt Book Fair and make a fool out of yourself. You can just cut out the middleman and do it. So maybe that is a way maybe that is a way. But I wonder with the internet, I mean, definitely for the Iranian books, sure, we can put them on the net and they'll have a life there. But I just wonder about the other books, like one of the books I worked on for the Prince Claus Fund was called Beautiful Ugly, which is about African and diaspora aesthetics, from like beaded dolls to music to murals. And I thought, well, if we did that book on the net, some people in Africa could see it, but wouldn't it be great if they could just hold the book? But maybe I'm being too ambitious for, the book form is old-fashioned now.
That's my second question. Do you have the book with you so we can see it?
She has the books.
Yeah, okay.
Well, certainly Else gave them out last week. She had them all here, so people, some of you might actually have taken some of them.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you. Well, the end of the first day, the first weekend. Thank you so much, Malu, for coming and being so generous with your thoughts. And thank you all for attending. I'm sure you're all exhausted. So I'd just like to close the day by thank you for all your questions and for all of your participation. Thank you. And one last thing for the caucus participants, I guess most of you know, but we're going to try and meet upstairs in the restaurant at 6 o'clock, so in about 15 minutes, okay? Thanks.